Okay, greetings, folks. I am streaming live on a very cold Australia morning, Australian Perth, Australian time. Um, that's why I'm wearing this. And I thought I'd just do a quick in in my lingo would be maybe 2 hours, maybe an hour and a half, but just like a review of Capturing Christianity's his take earlier, like about 6 hours ago, his take on the problem of suffering and evil and pain. So this review, I want this review to be received in in a form of constructive criticism, but at the same time in love and also in encouragement, because fr from what I've seen, anyone who's seen, say, the past, say, two Q&As, you've seen me share my thoughts on, say, Cameron's interaction with James White. Let me just take this off. So you've seen his interaction with James White and my frustrations with his engagement in the Catholic Protestant, you know, discussions, and um, ultimately it boils down to what James White himself would say: theology matters, an exegesis of the biblical text matters, and um, so Cameron has a lot going for him, and in my opinion, as a Christian brother, I would say praise God that he has a platform that's reached a level where he can now give a public. He has an opportunity to speak publicly. Um, Unfortunately, as you'll see in this talk, very little biblical exegesis. By the way, is my microphone volume, is that a bit too low? I'm hearing someone saying it's very low, saying that volume's good. All right. So, yeah, that just looks a bit wonky. Oh, I might as well just take that off for now. uh, yeah. So my my criticism is that what you'll see in a moment is that his engagement angle, he will go into a very brief example of, say, usage of Romans 5, and then he's not even like exegeting the particular verse in Romans 5 that actually goes right at the heart of the context of the topic that he's discussing. Rather, he'll quote the first couple of verses of Romans 5 that deal with how character building and when you face tough issues in life, what basically, to paraphrase, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And that rule is known. Not That's not unique to Paul. That's not unique to the Bible. That rule is like, the typical the golden rule. Like, all cultures know about how adversity brings about character building and so on. So, like, I'm sort of jumping ahead, but for Cameron to appeal to text and then just stop there. My frustration as a Christian is that, where's the bridge to the gospel? Where's the bridge to Jesus? Where's the bridge to, say, in this case, the triune God of the scriptures that generate the comfort? When Jesus says, "My yoke is take on my yoke. It's easy. The burden is light, um, which is an audacious claim on Jesus' part, but that's the validation. Um, that's part of the validating to see whether he has the genuine ability to give one comfort in light of suffering and pain and evil and all that. So he had like a 30-minute talk, and unfortunately, it just falls flat on a mere hypothetical. He introduces a lot of, here's the Boxing Day tsunami that took place. Here's a situation when someone murdered someone, and oh look, the father happens to forgive the murder of his son. Oh, and how ironic, it's a Muslim father. Which again, I'm not gonna involve myself in polemics here, like us versus them sort of mentality. But the point is, you're actually showcasing a positive outlook from a certain religious group, which is not Christian, and showcasing their best intent in that moment, which again, I would happily, as another religious person, I'd happily, I would join I would join their company in appealing to that common, selfless sort of attitude. Obviously, they're coming from a whole other religious, there's a lot of theological baggage on their end as to why they're doing that. But I'm not going to tackle that, polemically. To tackle that is a different video. But the point is, again, it's just a very minimal Christian message. That's my frustration. It's like, okay, you've shown a commendable, say, Muslim interaction in a court of law about a murderer. Why not some Christian examples? Why not? I mean, there's thousands of Christian examples throughout history. Again, but that doesn't mean the Christian examples validate, the gospel and the Christian message. But if you're talking to a church audience, it should be a Christ-focused Christian, biblically focused thing. And that's basically it. Then it ended with a Q&A situation, and then the Q&A. Someone asked a question about Satan, and to my surprise, Cameron just wholesale dismissed it by saying, I don't know. I don't know about Satan in the Bible. I don't know anything about what he does and who he is and so on. Consult the scholars on that issue. So we're going to get into that. I'm going to share what the scholars have to say on that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to share the video screen, and then we'll start going through the video, and then I will pause the video and make comments and so on. Okay. Let's see here.
All right, it is great to be here, and today, as you know, I'm talking about a very difficult subject, which is the problem of evil. And I'm going to do 3 different things in this message today. The first thing I'm going to do is I want to actually understand what this problem actually is. What is this problem of evil that we hear so much about, and how can we actually formulate it into an argument against the existence of God? So that's part 1. Part 2 is we're going to look at some responses to the problem of evil, as I'll lay it out in the first section. And then third, we're going to look at a problem of evil for atheists. I think that there is actually a good argument against atheism from evil. And that one is going to be really interesting, so definitely stay tuned to the very end. And that's actually like a YouTube thing. Stay tuned to the very end of the video. I was about to say that, but I'm too much into the YouTube world. All right, so first I want to issue a trigger warning as we get into this first section. So we're going to look at some very specific cases of suffering, and these involve small children. So if you would like to leave the room now, if you don't want to hear about any particular case, it's not going to be that bad, but I just wanted to issue the trigger warning.
Okay, I want to start with this trigger warning thing. Cameron, I don't know where you grew up in the world. I don't want to dismiss, say, your upbringing or whatever you experienced in life. But, and I understand protocol as far as like first world, Western uh, protocol in regards to, you know, discretion. Um, Beware, you know. Um, I've just come back from the Philippines, and that gave me, because I grew up in India. I was born in India. I left in '97. I was born in '88, and I haven't been back to a third world country basically since '97. And I spent about a month in the Philippines, and that was such a refresher to see, for myself, for my own eyes, um, just the plight of not just humans, but just everything, 24/7. Um, it's a constant fight for survival, and um, young children in those communities, there's no such thing as viewer discretion when you're talking about millions upon millions of people who are in that very situation. And there's sort of like this sort of an equivalent of like a pseudo PC, uh, discretion sort of thing. Because I mean, you're going to be talking about the topic, right? This pain, suffering issue, and um, and how would you approach this topic? Say if you were giving this very message to a Philippine church, which, by the way, I gave a message myself. I've recorded it. I could upload it on my channel. Like there's a few audio tweakings I need to do. Basically, I've spent about 3 or 4 hours giving my testimony and just going through the Bible A to Z. But I was relating with them directly with the chaos kampf, the struggle with chaos that they face every day. And then when they see God, the Creator, this, to in their eyes, technically this mysterious being, which even though culturally they are mostly Catholic, but let's just say have a Christian overlap as a culture. Um, by the way, is my internet breaking up? Am I losing you guys? Just want to make sure from the outside chat. Okay, it's doing all right. So imagine if you, in a third world country, basically kids that are literally just playing on the road while there's busy traffic, there's pollution, there's just so many dangers going on. You're talking about there's also disease, and there's just so much Western people take for granted. And I know I've taken for granted, like I've forgotten how much we take for granted here in the West. That the examples that you're going to share in a moment are like the tip of the tip of the tip of the iceberg. Yeah, the Boxing Day tsunami, just showing a wave coming in on the ocean is not really dramatic compared to the real scenes that people had to face. And not just back in 2004, but even currently right now, as I'm even streaming right now. Um, The court situation. Yeah, it's a touching moment of human decency, but like if you were to show actual graphic pain and suffering that these other people actually go through, um, I'm reminded of, say, David Attenborough. Um, Let me just bring him up very quickly. David Attenborough, he's a English broadcaster and he's a scientist as well. Sir David Attenborough. In fact, I've been watching a very recent uh, dinosaur documentary that he's been releasing. And I want to share. This. How would you respond to David Attenborough with respect to this quote? All right, where is that? Okay. Sorry, I have to keep searching for that. Is this it? Okay, here it is. So he was asked about, in this case, I mean, he considers himself agnostic. I've seen some documentaries where he does go into, he does he doesn't shy away from spiritualism. He does get a sense of awe and reverence about nature, and I'm a huge fan of his. But he's now 90. I think he's 96 now, and you have to wonder why. When asked whether his observation of the natural world has given him faith in a creator, he generally responds with some version of the story making reference to this particular parasitic worm. Okay? You see, now this is the real issue of pain and suffering right here. How does God work as a Christian, Cameron? How would you respond to someone like him when he speaks about God working in this way, so to speak? So, David says, my response is that when creationists, and he's talking about younger creationists here, who perceive of the world as perfect, like it started off perfect. So when creationists talk about God creating every individual species as a separate act, right? No evolution involved. They always instance hummingbirds or orchids, sunflowers, and beautiful things. But I tend to think instead of a parasitic worm that is boring through the eye of a boy sitting on the bank of a river in West Africa, a worm that's going to make him blind. And I ask them, are you telling me that the God you believe in, who you also say is an all-merciful God, who cares for each one of us individually, are you saying that God created this worm that can live in no other way than in an innocent child's eyeball? Because that doesn't seem to me to coincide with a God who's full of mercy. I would this last bit that he says here, I would love to have like a table talk chat with David about this. But the point is, this is a very valid perspective. And so to go into this, this sort of like trigger warning, you know, it's cringy. I literally cringe at that sort of thing. Um, the point is you don't even need to mention that. You can approach this topic right off the bat by getting into the discussion at hand, sharing relevant examples that, if a priority, if you were thinking of it as, oh, potentially this could trigger people, then just start off with something that can cause people in their own individualistic context can make them, because they are already aware of the pains and sufferings of this world. And therefore, if there's children in the audience, um, there is no covering of the ears or covering of the eyes by a majority of children around the world. And my frustration in this as well is that here in the West, younger children are forced to be cushioned and mollycoddled to avoid, the seriousness of life. And then when with this trigger warning stuff, trickle it down. How are these children, when they do then face the issues and problems in this world, how do they ultimately react? Guess what? They give up. So much for Romans 5, right? Too many times I've seen, the current generation of kids really, compared to, say, my folks and my grandparents who've been through, say, the First and Second World War and everything that's transpired. Like, when I go and compare the virtues and the values of, say, my Oma and my Opa with the current generation of, the typical meme culture, like, beta males and, all that stuff. It's true. And then when I go to a culture like the Philippines and I see how hard those people work, in hindsight of the fact that, especially now very recently with the political situation, that family that's just come back in who actually robbed the Philippines in the 80s. So their son has come back into that political power. But those people are literally, every day is just a new day of survival. Whether you're a kid or you're an 80-year-old Lola or Lolo. And so when I was talking with these, Philippine people, it's like I don't even need to translate anything to them. I don't need to remind them about the sufferings of this world. They already know it. So yeah, I don't know. This sort of like this trigger warning thing is just, it's unnecessary, in my opinion. Okay, let's continue with the video clip.
So if anyone would like to leave at this point, that's the time to leave. And the reason why I'm doing this is because I think that we have an obligation to face reality. That's the first reason. The second reason why we're looking at some specific cases is because it's actually going to help us understand what this problem is. So let's look at the first case. And this one, we've got a statistic, which is 38. According to the National Safety Council, America's leading nonprofit safety advocate, 38 children under the age of 15 die per year from heat stroke after being left in hot cars. Has anyone experienced this or had a close family member or friend who's experienced something this tragic? Well, it happens. There's a specific case that we're going to look at. His name is Juan Rodriguez, the father of one-year-old twins. He pleaded guilty in court for the deaths of his 2 children. Quote, the defendant, Juan Rodriguez, left his 1-year-old twins in the backseat of his car for 8 hours while...
Oh, I just want to point out as well, something like this, SpongeBob imagination, there were no eyeball worms at creation, no death before sin. I'm sorry. The Genesis text doesn't say that there was no deaths before sin. The Genesis text, Genesis 1, clearly says, Tohu Vabohu. Ancient Near Eastern creation accounts, and Genesis is a polemic against ancient Near Eastern creation accounts. All of them speak about a constant, this is known as the chaos kampf motif. the constant struggle with chaos. The only difference compared to the other ancient Near Eastern gods is that Yahweh is the one that not only defeats chaos in the sense of not removing it, he is able to tame it. Doesn't mean he eradicates it, he's able to tame it, and that's why he is then able to take his residence, his rest, in this cosmic temple that he's made for you and I to exist in. But the point is, thermodynamics, as we experience it right now, as I'm experiencing it right now, is exactly the same as Adam and Eve was experiencing it before the fall. Ultimately, you have to deal with the fact that Paul in Romans 8 very clearly says that that the creation was subject to futility, but not by anything it did. So the creation didn't introduce pain and suffering and death into the world. It was already there. But Paul clarifies. So, but by not by it was futile, but not by anything it did. So then who did it? And then he says, but the one who did it did so in the certainty that the creation would be set free from this corrupting bondage. So who's the one that did it? Oh yeah, it's God. God starts with chaos Kampf right from the start, and ultimately chaos Kampf is eradicated. It's defeated on the cross. And in the hypostasis of the Logos and the fleshy body of Jesus, which in evolution terms would mean Jesus' body is the cosmos, it's stardust. So in the hypostasis, God is basically reconciling the cosmos to himself and causing theosis. You see, this is where, this is the sort of theological trajectory Cameron should be going with respect to this topic. But yeah, I just saw this comment, and it's comments like this that does an injustice to the biblical text, to the gospel. When you're having a dialogue with, say, someone like a Richard Dawkins, or like David Attenborough.
He went to work. Bronx District Attorney Darcel Clark said, the children were strapped in their car seats throughout the hot summer day with no windows open. He told police he dropped off his 4-year-old son Tristan at a Westchester daycare, but forgot that his twins were in the rear-facing car seats. He said he returned to the car 8 hours later and started to drive away, according to police. He drove for 2 blocks before discovering the children, foaming at the mouth and lifeless. Now, this is an example of suffering brought about by free choice or human choice, and that's going to be important a little bit later on. So this is the first example, a really terrible example. Here's another terrible example of suffering. The next figure is 227,898. 227,898. The 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake and tsunami, also known as the Boxing Day tsunami, killed an estimated 227,898 people in 14 different countries, making it one of the deadliest natural disasters in recorded history. And actually, I have a video that we're going to see of the tsunami coming in. There's a father and his kids. They're playing on the beach in Malaysia when the tsunami waves start to come in. Now, quick warning.
Okay. How about this, Cameron? Forget about the Boxing Day tsunami. How about the fact that for the last scientists can look at the say the biodeposits in Earth's crust, and when they do an analysis of the inventory of the biodeposit. So what's a biodeposit? You're talking about basically, as you can see here, the biodeposit source. So coal, oil, natural gas, right? Kerogen, all that, right? Basically organics. So look at the amount of tons, okay? Quadrillions of tons. So when you add it all up, there's a total of anywhere between 76 to 217 quadrillions of tons worth of biodeposits in Earth's crust. Now, where did all that come from? It's not just the Japanese tsunami or the Boxing Day tsunami. This is the last 4.1 billion years of death that's taken place. You know, there's been many extinction events. Again, watching that dinosaur series with David Attenborough, he just before the release of that, he actually had a one episode review of the very latest findings in regards to the impact crater where the meteorite hit. And an excavation team actually found, for the first time, verification of the meteorite material itself lodged in a little bit of tree sap that was then solidified. And it, you know, in other words, it was sort of like confirmation of the very, like, within 20 minutes, because don't forget the explosion happened and, you know, the impact hit, and then 20 minutes later you have a projectile of meteorite rock landing to where the excavation team was located. And that was, you know, 65 million years ago. So how do you explain the biodeposits that's in Earth's crust? Because the Boxing Day tsunami is like a needle in a haystack compared to what's actually gone on in Earth's entire history.
The audio in this clip is not very good. It's kind of distorted. So just, I've warned the guys in the back, so just plug your ears if it's a little bit too loud. But let's go ahead and play the video.
Don't kid yourself. We all want sexy.
What sort of an ad is this?
Situation like that. So I have two very small children. I don't know like how I would react in a situation like that. It's horrible. But again, I think that we have an obligation to face reality. And then this is also going to help us really understand what this problem of evil actually is. And I think Christians, we don't have a choice. We have to take this problem of evil and suffering very, very seriously. So scientists investigating the damage of the Boxing Day tsunami found evidence that the tsunami waves reached a height of 80 feet when coming ashore along large stretches of coastline and rose to 100 feet in some areas when traveling inland. Now, this is an example of suffering brought about not by human choice, but by nature. And so we actually have a distinction that we can make here. This is going to help us develop and actually think about responses to the problem of evil. There's moral evil on the one hand and natural evil on the other. So there's two kinds of suffering. Moral evil is suffering brought about by the free choices of humans, like in the heat stroke case. And natural evil is suffering brought about by nature, like in the tsunami case. And so when we're looking for responses to this problem, we want responses that are going to address both types of suffering. Now, another distinction that's going to be helpful here is the practical versus the theoretical problems of evil. Daniel Howard Snyder, he's a Christian philosopher, he puts it this way. He says, the practical problem is about maintaining or restoring one's relationship with God in light of the suffering one is enduring. The theoretical problem of evil is about whether evil and suffering is good reason to think that God does not exist. In the practical problem, we're experiencing the reality of suffering and our relationship with God is strained as a result. However, in the theoretical problem, we basically just want to know if some philosophical argument succeeds or not. So one is experiential, and one is philosophical. And so today we're going to focus on the philosophical problem of evil. Does suffering provide a good reason to think that God does not exist? So the first way that this has been, or one of the ways that this has been articulated by atheists is by a guy named David Hume. And he puts the problem of evil like this. He says, is God willing to prevent evil, but not able? Then he is not omnipotent. Is he able, but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then from whence comes evil? You can tell he's kind of older with the whence. But what I want you to notice in this articulation of the problem of evil is that it's a question. But questions are not arguments. And this is something I point out on my YouTube channel a lot. Asking why God allows suffering is not an argument that God doesn't exist. And questions are just that. They're questions. They're trying to get information. Arguments, on the other hand, they assert informations. So questions get information, arguments assert information. Now, why is this even important? The problem of evil is often presented as a question. Why does God allow evil? But even if you don't know the answer to that question, it doesn't follow that God does not exist. It could be the case that God exists and has reasons for permitting suffering, but you just don't know what those reasons are. So questions are good, but they're different from arguments. And here's an appropriate response to someone that is asking this type of question about suffering. You know what? Actually, I don't know the answer to that. Like that is the answer that you could give to someone who is asking a question in the form of a question, the problem of evil. So another thing to keep in mind is that the problem of evil is a very emotional subject. Questions about suffering can be very emotional. I mean, the clips that we just watched, the story about the father, this is a very emotional subject. And so when you ask a question about suffering, it can just be very emotional. And what happens, if we're not careful, is emotional questions can actually make us think with our hearts instead of with our brains. In a similar way, advertisers use your emotions against you. So let's watch a following clip from Chevy Motors.
All right, so he plays a clip from, basically it's to do with this golden retriever, and it's to do with a car, and it's basically nothing else but it's focusing on the dog. And what he's trying to do here, I think, Cameron, what you're trying to do here, I see where you're going with this, but this is still a red herring. This is still, like notice you're already 12 minutes into your talk, and you, you're just showcasing the various means of say the human psyche. You know, this is sort of like going into say territory that say someone like Jordan Peterson would engage with, and so on. If you only have 30 minutes to make a talk, you should be getting straight into the core content of your argument as to answering the question with what basically you should have started with Hume, and then you should go on into a focused, say, gospel-centered and gospel-rich response with respect to, okay, Hume, these are good questions. Here's the arguments that would satisfy your questions to a certain degree.
Chevy. It had nothing to do with Chevy, did it? Yeah. So Chevy, notice in this commercial, they didn't set up like why their cars are better than the other cars. They didn't argue that Chevy gets better gas mileage, that they're safer. What they want you to do is they want you to skip over all that stuff. They don't want you to think and reason and stop and slow down and actually think about what's going on. They want you to skip directly to the conclusion, I need to buy this car. And I think that's similar to what's going on when you get an emotional question about evil, is that it can bypass your reasoning and it can make you jump to a conclusion that doesn't actually follow. But what we want to do is we want to be guided by the truth. We don't want to be guided by our emotions. So now let's turn from an articulation of the problem of evil that's based in a question. Let's now turn to one that's actually posed as an argument.
Yeah, no, I would agree with you on that. Yeah, guided by truth, not emotions, because what you know may not be so, and emotional gut feelings at the end of the day is not the scientific means as to pursuing truth. Epistemologically, you have to set aside bias and go from there.
Because arguments from evil have been made. So this one comes from a guy named William Rowe. He's an atheist philosopher, and he gives an argument that can be summarized like this. Premise 1, if God exists, there is no pointless suffering. Premise 2, there is pointless suffering. And the conclusion just straightforwardly follows, so God does not exist. Now,
okay, now very quickly, this is a good summarization of what Rowe was arguing. Now, here's my attempt at responding to these premises over here. If God exists, there is no pointless suffering. You see, I don't know what other people are gathering from that, or especially ultimately what's deep down Rowe's mind when he articulates the first premise by saying pointless suffering. What if I were to reword it and say, if God exists, there can still be suffering. And then maybe if I modify that a bit more, I could say, if God exists, there could be not like a non-pointless suffering, like basically a form of suffering that is there's a reason for it. Does it make God into this tyrant figure? No, no, no. That's a whole different issue. Um, so just to cut to the chase, I hold to like a sort of like a Leibniz uh, uh, theodicy, and how Leibniz portrayed the best of all possible worlds, and in my opinion that Leibniz's perspective on that actually is a perfect doorway to, believe it or not, the ancient Near Eastern perceptions of reality, ultimately with what the Genesis author was trying to get at, and then ultimately what, later on in the Second Temple Pauline theology, what Paul's trying to get at. In other words, just to summarize what Leibniz was arguing, if God is these omni attributes, then how can he create a a if this is the best of all possible worlds? So it's not that he creates in time, because the whole issues with like where is God located, and then because there's this universe that seems to have an origin from a certain place, so to speak. So it's what Leibniz was getting at is that you have this emergence of reality. The moment you perceive it that way, there's no such thing as putting like a Cartesian point with respect to the emergence of, say, where did the Big Bang take place and when. If you're looking at it from, say, a multiverse perspective, like, oh, there's the universe where Cameron and all of us are going to be in, like, we can put like a Cartesian point on that. No. From Leibniz's point of view, the universe emerges, and then that follows through into God's kenosis with respect to not only kenosis but also hypostasis with respect to this emerging reality that you and I call the universe. Okay, now Leibniz then says that whatever the attributes God has, he can't share those attributes with this emerging thing, because the moment there's a sharing with it, he's contradicted himself. So, for example, something like the issue of pain and suffering and death is obviously antithetical to God, right? Hence, if God exists, there is no pointless suffering. Yeah, ontologically, imagine God just whatever he is, right? But to keep things simple, the omni attributes. How would God, for all eternity, in a triune sense, how would he suffer? Is there suffering? And those very anthropomorphic and anthropological experiences, how could you then connect that to the philosophical attributes that we apply to God? It doesn't work. So premise one is true. There is no pointless suffering if God exists. But this is where I would upgrade and nuance the breaking down of this. The biblical answer is, and Leibniz's ultimate answer is, the moment you have an emergence of a created thing. So the biblical, throughout the Bible, you'll see analogies of the potter and the clay. The potter is the one that has the sovereignty to shape the clay and so on. So that means the clay is not ontologically the potter. So the universe is not ontologically Yahweh. So therefore, ontologically, what is it in comparison to Yahweh? As it independently, but at the same time is subject to God, right? But independently, now it has this existence. So, should it not have properties that would make it um, not only less than God, but that it very much shows how it is less than God. So, for example, if God is eternal, no pointless suffering, and so on. No, now notice that phrase, no pointless suffering. What that's saying is there's no suffering, zero suffering. Pointless, the word pointless is like an emphasis on the type of suffering taking place, but the point is no suffering. So if the creation that emerges from God is not God, ontologically God, then with respect to the creation, I would say there's suffering. Because if there's no point of suffering in the creation, then ergo the creation is ontologically God. It's sharing in one of the attributes of who He is. So, and I'll get into this in a moment, but isn't it interesting that the biblical text says exactly this in the context that it's always emphasizing a to creation perspective. It's not saying, nor in the Bible do we see anywhere where God has this one and only plan to create. Probably the closest passage you can get to in this is, say, Job 38. Where God is confronting Job and saying, "Hey, Job, when I had plans to make the creation and so on." Or even Proverbs 8, verse 22 onwards, you have this notion of wisdom as the wisdom element of God as emerging, but it's not created. That's a very interesting difference. It's wisdom that seems to emerge, but from eternity past, which is in hypostasis with God. So if God is eternal, wisdom is eternal, and now you have two eternal things in hypostasis. So therefore, that's the Trinity taking place. But the point is, before the hills were made, and before this and that, I existed, and then creation takes place. Psalm 104 mentions the same thing. Whatever God is, then a deductive, sort of like a paraphrase of Genesis 1. And then the Bible ends in Revelation 21:22 with the actual plan that God had in mind right from the start. Revelation 20:22, by the way, is not the only place in the Bible you see this theme play out right throughout, say, the prophets in the Old Testament, like Isaiah 66. So John in Revelation is repurposing eschatological hopes, um, with respect to a new creation and so on. So the point is, you have a two creation model because it's the Jews that were saying, through divine revelation, that this creation, to use terminology you see in Hebrews, is a shadow of the greater, construction, the greater ecclesia, the greater tabernacle. I'd love to, uh, maybe give this as a perspective. In Revelation 21, we have the New Jerusalem coming down, and just want to make sure if this works all right. If I do that, it seems to be okay. Okay. When the New Jerusalem's coming down, now some scholars wonder if it's a cube. Now, I'm of there's some other scholars which I agree with more so. Yes, it gives the impression of it coming as a cube. I don't think so. I think it's coming as an inverted pyramid. The reason why is because John very deliberately, in poetic, figurative numbers, purposely changes between a stadia and a cubit. So it's so many stadia in length, which is a Roman unit, but it's so many cubits in width, which is a Semitic unit of measurement. Now, scholars will then say, "Oh, see, I mean, if you're going to take the stadia literally, you're talking about like a 1,500-mile high wall with like only a 200, and the wall is only 200 feet thick, which is just totally disproportionate." And I agree with them on that. But curiously, though, if you take the width there, and you can look this in the Greek grammatical context, but if you take the width and you apply it with respect to the perpendicular height, so you have a square base, and then you have what should be the four corners going out like that, right? I mean, well, technically going up if it's a box, but if you take the height as being in the middle, with respect to it being that width, the 200 feet width, so then what's happening is it's a square base, but it's a pyramid, and the pyramid peak is 200 feet or 250 feet. Now John therefore is recounting the Babel story, which is a ziggurat, and there you have humans in their pride trying to, reach the heavens, as the text says. And we see this all the time, even today. If I was to paraphrase the Genesis 11 text, I would see it in transhumanism with respect to the topic of pain and suffering. We are trying to build ourselves a bridge to heaven, so to speak, to overcome chaos kampf. The biblical account says, no. God descends with his tower of Babel, so to speak, his ziggurat structure. It's a temple made without hands, right? It's an eternal house, an eternal oikos, as Paul would say. And then you have this marriage of heaven and earth in that union, and now you have a second, creation, but it's a creation that is actually what God wanted all along to begin with. Because this comes back full circle to Leibniz. So, just to summarize, God can't create another Yahweh. Yahweh can't create another Yahweh, because if the creation started perfect, no death, no suffering, blah, 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 he's created another Yahweh. So this creation that emerges out of him emerges with already a ontological parameter that gives it its unique attributes in itself. And since it's a created thing, right? Because Yahweh is uncreated, but this is a created thing. Therefore, ergo, it can't share Yahweh's attributes. Therefore, what is natural to the system, things like a created object, has now finiteness to it. And one of the big mysterious properties of the arrow of time is, if you go down the physics route, it's the problem with respect to entropy, thermodynamics, all that. Philosophically, that's again chaos kampf. God knows that. He still goes along with it. And then ultimately, God's solution is, if I care about this thing that I've created, I care about it in the sense that I already have in mind a plan where I will marry myself to the chaos kampf of this this creation I made. So in other words, the Jesus story is again that marrying, that union, and then God defeats death and transforms it, theosis. He transforms it to his level, so that now ontologically, the creation is ontologically with the Father, Son, and Spirit, with the Blessed Trinity. That's the biblical story. So, if God exists, there is no pointless suffering. Yeah, if you're in the shoes of God. Then point number 2, there is pointless suffering. Yeah, and it's not God's fault that there is pointless suffering. And here's another thing, you are thinking it's pointless. For example, when I read David Attenborough's, the situation with the worm going into the eyeball of the child, there's just so many fine-tuning parameters in light of the fact that we have a chaos, conf, pain, suffering world. It's ironic, as, for example, when Colin Humphreys, not Colin Humphreys, the guy who he debated Richard Dawkins on Unbelievable. He worked on the Genome Project, and he also worked with COVID. Let me quickly bring up that clip just to show you. Oh, Francis Collins. So Francis Collins spoke about COVID, and he speaks about how viruses, you need viruses to, if there's no such thing as viruses, life doesn't exist, ironically enough, right? So you have gut bacteria, and, just to give, like, say, an everyday example. Anyway, the point is, the biblical story gives you a 2 creation model. So when premise 2 says there is pointless suffering, pointless is in the context of this philosopher already making an argument that like he's absolutely sure that there is this, that the suffering that we go through is pointless. Okay, that's where I would disagree. I would say, if God exists, there is no pointless suffering. Or, just to keep it simpler, if God exists, there is no suffering. There is suffering. But then notice the argument. If you're going to stick with the breakdown here, it's starting off with the premise, if God exists. So then naturally, obviously, since number 2 exists, there is suffering. Philosophically, in this deductive argument, you're then arguing, like, ergo, how can God exist in that sense? You see, and this is why these so-called philosophical breakdowns, in my opinion, I think sometimes they're just useless. So there is suffering. Maybe in Rowe's eyes, the philosopher who wrote this, maybe he's perceiving it as pointless. So a lot of scientists would tell you that when you go into chaos theory, it's quite organized. It's organized chaos. But so therefore, once you've already explained the nuance of number 1 and then number 2, how then can you then conclude God does not exist? Right? So this is how I would engage this these 3 points. Now let's hear what Cameron has to say.
This is actually a valid argument. And what I mean by that is that if both premises are true, if God exists, there is no pointless suffering, premise 1. Premise 2, there is pointless suffering. If those 2 premises, those 2 steps of the argument are true, then the conclusion that God does not exist actually is also true. And so what we want to do is we want to question whether or not these 2 premises are true. And the premise that I'm going to focus on, Christians actually have objected to that first premise. They think that God's existence is actually compatible with pointless suffering. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at that second premise. There is pointless suffering. Is it actually true that suffering is pointless? So what I'm going to do is we're going into section 2, where we're looking at 3 different reasons why God might have to allow suffering.
Hey, Greg Morgan here. What if I told you in about 2 hours I could get you started trading the currency market?
So a couple quick caveats before we get started into these different reasons is that these reasons should not be taken in isolation. Rather, these three reasons should be taken together. And I'll reiterate that as we go along. And then also, the three reasons that I'm covering today should not be thought of as exhaustive. There are other reasons that Christians have brought up and that Christians discuss in the literature on the problem of evil, but the three that I'm going to discuss are some of the most prominent reasons. So the first reason is free will. Free will. Now, free will is actually kind of difficult to define, but it's basically the idea that we aren't robots. We're not robots. We make our own choices. So, for example, I was free to come and speak with you this morning. It was within my power to refrain from coming on stage and speaking. So here are two positive aspects of free will. Has anyone seen the movie Aladdin? It should be everybody. It should be everybody. So at one point in the movie Aladdin, Aladdin goes up to the genie, and the genie's like, hey, look, there's some things I just can't do. Even though he's all powerful, he can't make people fall in love. And so the ability to love, and this is just like the movie shows that this is a really common belief among people, is that you can't force people to fall in love. You have to actually love someone freely. And so free will actually makes the possibility of love possible. The second positive aspect of free will is that it makes self-determination possible. There's a guy who I quoted earlier, Daniel Howard Snyder. I'm going to quote him again. He's awesome. You got to look him up. For one to be self-determined is for one to be free to a significant degree with respect to the sort of person one becomes. Lacking such freedom, we could not be deeply responsible for who we are, who we will become, and whether we will manifest and confirm our character through the choices that we make. Now, how this relates to suffering is that if we are free to love others and to self-determine our character, then we're also free to be unloving. We're also free to hurt people. We're free to leave children in hot cars. But the idea here is that free will is so valuable that it makes the possibility of harm worth it. So here's a quick analogy. Getting my kids vaccinated with a needle is going to hurt them temporarily, but being vaccinated is so valuable that it makes the suffering worth it. And that's kind of the idea behind free will, is that free will makes any kind of suffering that is the result of free will, it makes it worth it. Now, that being said, there are some negative aspects of free will that kind of put a question mark on this reason. The first one is that too much freedom is actually a bad thing. So my son is 4 years old. His name is Hendrix. If I were to give him the freedom to wield a kitchen knife, that would be bad on my part. I would be giving him too much freedom. And so there's kind of this question of like, did God give us too much freedom? Do we have too much free will that we can use to hurt other people? So that's just one question mark on this reason. Another question mark is that free will doesn't actually account for natural evil. Remember that distinction I made earlier between moral evil and natural evil. Suffering as a result of nature, free will doesn't really account for it. So we've got to turn to other reasons. The next reason is called natural law. Natural law. Let's go ahead and put up the picture of the house and the fire. To reason and make free choices, the world has to be predictable. We have to be able to predict the consequences of our actions. I need to know if lighting a match in a house could result in it burning to the ground. To be truly responsible for our actions, we must be able to weigh the consequences of our actions. And that requires a world that is orderly, a world that operates according to natural laws. Now, I think the best way to really see this reason in its full strength is to imagine a world of chaos. The guy I quoted earlier, Daniel Howard Snyder, I'm going to quote him again. He says, suppose I chose to give you a flower and a big hug to express my affection. But my limbs behaved so erratically that it was just as likely that my choice could result in what I intended as that I would poke you in the eye and crush your ribs. Then he says, the very laws of momentum that enable you to give and receive flowers will also cause a falling boulder to crush you if you happen to be under it. And then finally he says, in general, the sources of natural evil, which afflict non-human animals and us, disease, sickness, disasters, birth defects, and the like, are all the outworking of the natural system of which we are a part. We can go ahead. Oh, there we go. Already got it up. You guys are staying on top of it. According to June Korenega, a geophysicist at Yale University, without plate tectonics, Earth could become hot and inhospitable, a hot and inhospitable world just like Venus. But plate tectonics can also cause tsunamis that kill hundreds of thousands of people. So this is kind of the idea behind this natural law reason. Now, here's the question with natural law. Does natural law actually do enough? Does it provide a good reason why parents lost their children in the Boxing Day tsunami? And that's just something you can think about on your own. Some days I think that it is enough, some days I don't think that it's enough, but just think about it on your own. Just like in the free will example, too much free will is a bad thing. But perhaps in the case of too much regularity, there could be too much regularity, too much order in the world. So maybe God should intervene in the cases of huge tsunamis that are going to kill hundreds of thousands of people. So let's now turn to my favorite reason, which is called soul building. Soul.
Okay. So based on those two examples, again, why you're setting up what's been discussed for thousands of years, really, and and you're not actually giving any like, notice you're not actually giving a biblical solution. You start off with free will, then natural law, and okay, you try and figure it out now. Uh, God, at the end of the day, it's like a quasi fine-tuning argument. Too much regularity, that doesn't really balance the equation, right? Um, you don't even. The point is, you're setting up people with a sense of anxiety. Like, oh well, now we're back to square one again. Uh, well, how do we accommodate free will with respect to choices and the circumstances that take place? The point is, and here's where it gets really ironic, scientifically, and it's just a fact, the arrow of time is always going to move forward, and there's always going to be cause and effect phenomena where, for example, the guy who leaves his child in the car, yes, he had a free will to not just get out of the car and so on, but there's a whole sequence of events that transpire that have now led to that moment where that morning or whenever he got out of the house and then put the kids in the car and drove to that shopping mall and then got out and then went in and like now that's a form of hard determinism that I'm sharing here. Me personally, I don't think it's that rigid. I personally think that there's so many avenues that the arrow of time can take. But the point is, in fact, I would say there's infinite possibilities at any given moment, but then it snaps to just that one moment. And then the next moment after that, again, it goes back to infinite moments. And God, in his sovereignty and in his grace, there's like, when we have the perspective of time being one-dimensional and unidirectional, we then lose the hindsight of the fact that God, the way the Bible describes him, starts to go beyond into a what you could argue as a multi-dimensional perspective. So just to give you guys an example of where I'm going with this, I'll bring up my mock study notes that I've been writing, and let me go to the relevant page. I want to mention it. Oh, here we go. Okay, let's for example take Judas as a litmus test in this. So here we have the Last Supper. All right. Now, I go quite deep into this in my study notes. So again, if anyone wants access to this, just access it through the Google Drive link in the video description, and just say, yeah, I was watching the stream and I want to go there. So Mark's readers know what to expect. So for the disciples, it was disturbing news when Jesus said, "One of you is going to betray me, one who is eating with me." And obviously this expression echoes Psalm 41, a text that describes the painful experience of another righteous sufferer. Sharing a meal was an expression of trust and friendship, and being betrayed by a trusted friend is the worst kind of betrayal. Thus all disciples except Judas were very sad that one of them would be involved in his arrest. The question, surely I am not the one, am I, expects a negative answer, but the fact that they even ask the question one after the other seems to express some self-doubt. The answer by Jesus is not specific. He reiterates that it will be one of you, 12, a disciple who is present at the table, the one who is dipping his bread into the bowl with me. Dipping Okay. So then, now let's see the wisdom of, say, the early church fathers. How, say, the patristics, how they would engage with this topic. So Origen, for example, he says the following. He says, while he might have at once specially pointed out the betrayer, he did not do so, but said generally, one of you will betray me. So the character of each might be tested by the witness of his astonished heart. Okay, so this underscored the goodness of the disciples who believed Christ's words more than their own consciousness, and the wickedness of Judas because he did not believe the one who knew his plans. He embraced the obscurity by lying through his own teeth. If the 11 apostles were of good conscience, having not in any way betrayed their teacher, why were they grieved as though it might have been that he was speaking of one of them? I think that each of them knew from Jesus' teaching that human freedom is infinitely changeable and may easily be turned toward evil. So I just love Origen's perspective here. Human freedom is infinitely changeable, right? It can be turned toward evil. It may happen in a struggle against principalities and powers and rulers of this world of darkness that one may fall quite unexpectedly into evil. And, if I was to build on what Origen's saying here, I would build and further call it, it's ultimately it's the result of chaos conf that we are in. It's this corrupting bondage, as Paul would say in Romans 8. So either being deceived or overcome by demonic powers, each disciple feared lest it be he who was foreknown as betrayer. Now, just to clarify, foreknowledge doesn't necessarily mean predestination. You don't marry the two. There's a foreknowledge of an event. That doesn't mean the event is predestined. Okay? And so one of God's attributes, omniscience. That means God is truly omniscient if he foreknows an event, but does not predestine that event. Predestining an event does not equate to, how can God show off his omniscience if he predestines something? So now, based on this example, Jesus then utters this next statement. So why does it have been better for him if he had never been born? That's a pretty shocking. Better for him if he had never been born. Now, obviously, in the Christian theological sense, right, even though his arrest, trial, death are the fulfillment of God's plan, Judas is responsible for his own actions and will be judged on his death, ruin, and destruction. Okay? And then Origen continues and he says, there was another by whom he was betrayed, namely the devil, of whom Judas was the instrument. The woe is not only for Judas, but for all who betray Christ. And even John of Damascus, he says, knowledge is of what exists, and foreknowledge is of what will surely exist in the future. For simple being comes first, and then good or evil being. But if the very existence of those who through the goodness of God are in the future to exist were to be prevented by the fact that they were to become evil of their own choice, evil would have prevailed over the goodness of God. In this way God makes all his works good, but each becomes of its own choice good or evil. Although then the Lord said, good were it for that man that he had never been born, he said it in condemnation not of his own creation, but of the evil which his own creature had acquired by his own choice and through his own heedlessness. Okay, so this is now becoming quite self-evident, right? This is, the rest, all these paragraphs, I give more examples of, this language of free will, right? This tension of free will working with that, and I give examples of, like, symptoms of an overemphasis on free will. You know, um, so when a person stresses too much on our will and not enough on God's will, the results include working to please God or justify ourselves before Him by being good and doing good, while also viewing sin as dangerous and enticing, so that there's very rigid external man-made restraints, right? So if there's an overemphasis on the free will, then life seems increasingly exhausting and draining rather than joyous and fulfilling, and fear that one has not done enough good things, or fear that one has done too many bad things. And so this is sort of like a build-up. I give back and forth. This is more of a theological emphasis here. Then I go into symptoms of an overemphasis on, say, predestination, right? Now, what I want to get at specifically with the Judas example is actually the following over here. So Jesus anticipated our difficulty in trying to see how it all fits together within our familiar patterns of reasoning and problem solving. So He anticipated our temptation to pick and choose pieces of truth to overlap other pieces when the puzzle's picture makes no sense. And to understand and accept any key doctrine of the Christian faith requires an appeal to God's higher ways and higher thoughts. Now, this is the key emphasis of my point and my criticism of Cameron's message here. How does he bridge God's higher ways and higher thoughts, which is obviously evident in the biblical text? Well, I wouldn't. Let me rephrase that question. Not how does he bridge. Why does he not bridge God's high ways and higher thoughts? Why doesn't he do it going right to the secondary source, or in this case the primary source, which is the Bible? Why tackle it from a philosophical presumption? So, through the centuries, Christians have struggled to force-fit the truth into a four-dimensional frame. But since the Spirit can help us resist the compulsion to strife, distortion, division, then we should be ready to discover what can be accomplished by approaching it as a paradox, or at least by putting it to the paradox test. Thus, we can still end up with the truth even if we cannot picture it in our mind's eye, in a picture that makes sense. We will receive the benefits of embracing the whole truth rather than a lopsided portion of it. Thus, we're dealing with a paradox rather than with a contradiction. This is because our four-dimensional perspective frames the biblical statements affirming our freedom of choice and responsibility for our choices. Biblical statements affirming God's sovereign control over all things, which includes our choices, are framed in the divine perspective that supersedes our natural realm, going beyond the four dimensions we experience. Thus, from the divine perspective, God calls or chooses those who will be saved, while from our perspective, we do the calling or choosing. No one receives salvation without choosing to receive it, and no one receives salvation unless God chooses that person to receive it. In other words, all of us who choose salvation will receive it, and all of us whom God chooses to receive salvation will receive it. In four-dimensional thinking, God's choosing makes us puppets, having no real freedom, and free choice for humans would be illusory in light of this truth. But transferring from one frame of reference to the other helps make everything compatible. So, unfortunately, some Christians tend to emphasize that predestination pertains only to salvation, specifically to that moment when an individual becomes born again. Thus, the tension of the paradox of our free will and divine predestination is minimized, even marginalized, by insisting on applying it only to a one-time experience that is humanly intangible and abstract. However, the Bible reveals that predestination extends beyond the justification component of salvation to include sanctification, glorification, even our experiences before justification. So, just to sort of like skip those parts there. So in other words, on the human choice side, the system is defined partly by space and time dimensions, specifically the unidirectional single time dimension in which cause and effect always proceed in that order. It is defined by limited freedom because human life begins and unfolds with a number of circumstances over which individuals have no choice. For example, we cannot choose to whom we are born, or when, or where, or how we will be treated at different times by others. We cannot choose the characteristics of body, mind, personality that are genetically determined. So absolute freedom of choice does not exist. And for other factors in our lives are varying constraints on our capacities to choose and control. And here's, a table showcasing there's no control, but rather there's a certain form of inheritance that you have. Birthplace, relatives, genetics, aptitude, ancestral wealth, stuff like that. Now, there's some control, circumstantial control, in your workplace, associates, your physique, skills, occupation. And there's even more considerable control with respect to the moral situation. Dwelling, friends, diet, exercise, responsibility, integrity, thriftiness, investment. This is where that, the person in the car that was, quite inadequate in the way he, just the way he was, a negligent father in that sense. Cause and effect. The kids can't just magically, survive. The fact is, the laws of nature are in operation. Suddenly, it can't just suddenly just be like this magical different sets of laws of nature just for the sake of the kids to survive because God decides to be merciful or something. The point is, cause all of reality is uniform. Whether you're looking at some distant quasar 13 billion light years away, the fact is the physics is the same there as it is over here. And because of that man's choice to do what he did, that's the you reap what you sow. Famous biblical statement. So now here's where it gets interesting. God's freedom of choice also has limits, though his limits are self-imposed. So, for example, can God create a rock so massive that he cannot lift it? If we answer that he can create such a rock, we admit God's inability to lift or move the rock and imply he is less than all-powerful. If we say he cannot create such a rock, then we declare him limited in his creative abilities. If we identify the impasse as a contradiction, we must live with a knot that cannot be untangled. We imply that God may not be logically consistent and or totally truthful. However, the answer to this question arises when we address a semantic issue of the question, which is the misuse of the word can in order to adjust our perspective. So in other words, it is about what God will do than about what he can do. Thus, there are some things that God will not do. But this has nothing to do with a power limitation. Instead, God cannot do certain things because he is powerful enough and righteous enough to choose not to do them. Notice how when you angle the response in the theological framework, not a philosophical framework, in a theological framework, it answers these philosophical questions that say atheists will raise. Okay, God cannot do certain things because he is powerful enough and righteous enough to choose not to do them. Now, biblical examples, here are some examples, like he cannot lie or distort the truth. There's all the biblical examples. God cannot do evil. There's all the biblical examples. God cannot accept evil. There's all the biblical examples. God cannot overlook evil. Again, biblical examples. So why can he not do these things? He cannot because he is perfectly consistent. His character is immutable. It simply does not change. Biblical examples. His perfection, holiness, love, truthfulness, goodness, and faithfulness remain unchanged and unchangeable. They do not begin and end because God does not begin and end. His unchanging character reveals his power, a power that we do not possess, to maintain complete character consistency. He is not subject to the immaturity, ignorance, lack of love, short-sightedness, or genetic and chemical factors that influence our judgments, decisions, and actions. God has the power to maintain his perfection with perfect self-control. Thus, on the divine choice side, the system is defined by God's dimensions, which we know add up to at least, using our limited perspective, at least 11 dimensions of our space-time type, which obviously would include more than just our 1 dimensions of time. So in other words, considering what this extra dimensionality makes possible, we begin to see several ways the problem may be resolved. It does fit the definition of a paradox, but this system allows our will and God's will to operate independently in some contexts and interdependently in other contexts. Schematic illustrations can help us grasp how such a system could operate, because the system must include the influence of our fallen nature, and as God draws us toward accepting his truth, life, and love, our autonomous impulse tends to draw us away from God's truth, life, and love. Now, just to skip to the schematic, again, this is, notice, you're looking at time as unidirectional, and this is, over time, here's sort of like a growth towards Christ-likeness. So you have an amplitude of growth, and then an amplitude of, say, rebellion, decreasing over time. It's a sort of simultaneous thing. So in other words, we can make models to sort of see the way things move forward, the way God works with us, and how we interact, and because at the end of the day, notice that these schematic illustrations highlight a universal truth and fact, and that is we're all subject to chaos and God himself knows that, and Jesus. This is why the incarnation, this is why Jesus, this is why the gospel is so important. This is why it is good news for God to, in that one and only moment in human history, or not just that, the whole universe's history, to have a hypostasis where he is, part of the cosmos. His body is stardust. And then on the cross when he dies, and then when he resurrects, it's that resurrecting power that not just affects you and me, it affects the whole cosmos. Because his body does come through the process of evolution. Ultimately, you can trace it back to the Big Bang, which, God's the reason why the Big Bang happened. So now, I get into creation stuff over here, but this is, I'm going to get back to Cameron's video, but where I was going with that is ultimately these examples here with respect to time. So here are just simple illustrations where if we expand our perspective of one dimension of time into, say, if we broaden it into, say, 2 dimensions of time, or even 3 dimensions of time, you start to notice that the pain and the suffering of this world happens in the context of the fact that everything is trapped. Even you and me, the beauties of this world as well as the evils and the darkness of this world. We're all in this, confined to the one arrow of time. Now, in this example over here, when you look at the Bible, for example, so on the left, God can arbitrarily stretch the human experience of time, so, 1 day is like 1,000 years, by operating along a variety of timelines, such as A and B. And though A and B have equal length, if we superimpose them on our timeline X, we would experience A as being longer than B. So here's the example is over here. Here's our timeline. At any given moment, the only way for this to even be a possibility is if there's a second dimension of time that can arbitrarily. So, in other words, if you took a length of time A and you just skewed it, into now a second dimension, and then the vector of it points in a certain direction, but still it is married to our timeline X. So notice that then it's an arbitrary stretching. So A was a certain length, but now it's a stretching. So the perception is that it's longer. How about the same length, but we'll call it B, where you skew it a different way, and now, although it's that is the original length, the point is it takes only a very short time to transpire. We see this sort of effect in relativity, time dilation. Now, what about this example? So you can have infinite timelines going back and forth. You can have timeline C that has a like an origin that starts from there out, and then you can have basically no start, no end on timeline B. What about this example over here, where let's see here. So on the left, God can proceed for as long as one decides on timeline A, but in an independent dimension on timeline B, time is not progressing at all. This is because timeline A is perpendicular to timeline B, and on the right, with the timeline perpendicular to ours, God could divide up 2 billion hours into 7 billion slices, each 20 minutes. So in other words, God can easily pay attention and respond to the entire human race, praying to him at the same time. The timeline A can proceed for infinity while timeline B is static or paused. So that's with respect to this chart over here. So if you have timeline B, which is our time, a second dimension of time perpendicular to our time, which means now you have an instant of time, and God can now, for infinite time, and out of that infinite slice, he can then take a chunk of 7 billion individuals for 20 minutes each, and can hear them simultaneously in an instant of time. You see, these are limited examples of how, if you're in that audience, this is the sort of examples you should be sharing with respect to, here's a possible model on how God can interact with his creation, and how the bigger picture, in other words. Yes, the problem of evil and suffering is a serious discussion to have, but the world and the situations going on, and especially when, for example, when I went to the Philippines, and I'm seeing, like, stepping into the shoes of these other people and how they deal with life. It's just absolutely amazing to see how ignorant one can be, and how quite shallow in their judgment and presumptuous with there's a third world scenario and example, and you have two extremes in that discussion. One will say, oh, what loving God would have these people suffer the way they're suffering? And then the other example would be from, say, the religious person, oh, the reason why they're starving is because of human sin and depravity. You see, both of those two extremes are just emotional frustrations at the so-called problem. But then when you go to that person, like say when I went to the Philippines, and you actually interact with those people and you see how they respond back to you about their so-called plight, it's just amazing to see how they turn back on you and say, what do you mean that I'm suffering and I'm in a bad situation and so on? This is just my way of life. This is just like I'm used to this. My accommodation to this is such that this is just the way it is. And that just changes it's just a whole different perspective. So then now multiply that out into multiple scenarios of how much more of a variety of life stuff going on, not just amongst humans, amongst animals for the last 4.1 billion years. Like think about it. There's just a lot that goes on in this world. And as something as simple as this schematic of just the concept of time, where if you have a being that transcends our finite, one-dimensional, and unidirectional thing of time, he has then the ability to accommodate those 7 billion slices. That's just absolutely amazing. Which then leads to this point, and that is this painting by Salvador Dali, which I absolutely love, because Dali's point was that it's interesting that if you were to unravel a hypercube, a tesseract, it takes the shape of a cross. In other words, if you took a 4-dimensional hypercube and you brought it down a dimension into 3 dimensions, it then takes the shape of this cross-like depiction that you're seeing there. The point that he's trying to say is that Christ's atonement is multidimensional. So Jesus can atone for sin, past, present, future, for as many individuals as required. And that's how you can make sense of biblical statements that, if you freely come and believe on his name, you're justified and imputed righteousness and, all that stuff. So, let's see here. And then if this is just 2 dimensions of time, you can even go into 3 dimensions of time with respect to the sphere. So like, if this was, say, the longitude of from U to E, right? So the universe's start, then there's the birth of the person, the present time, the death of a person, and the end of the universe. There's G, God, right at the top. Wondering if that's coming up clear for you guys. Let me zoom in more. So in 3 dimensions of time, so this is now going into a non-Euclidean sort of geometric sense. So God's up here, and simultaneously he can affect the universe's start, your birth date, your death date, the present, and the end, all simultaneously. If you were to imagine time in this sort of spherical 3-dimensional analogy. So now, notice that in 2 dimensions of time, infinite time on our timeline can be shrunk down to less than 1/trillionth of a second for God. But 3 dimensions of time allow for infinite time to the 3rd power, literally infinity to the power of 3, to be compressed into less than 1/trillionth of a second. Thus, billions of years in our 1 dimension of time can be just a single instant for God. In that single instant, God could see every event in all time, including every event in the lives of every human who has ever lived, is living, or ever will live. He would see in exquisite detail everything that belongs to our future. The past and present is the present for him. Because of God's power and love, his foreknowledge implies much more than mere possession of information. He has the capacity to use that information to influence future events. So, for example, Paul says, now here's the famous quote in Romans 8, for those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son. This bit here, to be conformed to the image of his Son, this is what Christians they overlook this statement. Okay, think about it. To be conformed to the image of his Son. Wow. What is the image of his Son? And what does it mean to be conformed to the image of the Son? How does that work? How does do I can't, what can I do to be conformed to Jesus and whatever his image is? Here we go with the early church depictions of theosis, deification, basically divinization. That this is this notion of like what Athanasius would say, God became man so that man might become God. It's that full circle cycle of a two creation model. God creates, suffering, pain, evil, all that stuff is natural to the system. It's not God's fault. It's natural to the system because it's not God. God then comes down, wraps it all up, and takes it up to him. There's a transformation. That's being conformed to the image of his Son language. So for those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son. And then here's the point. In order that the Son might be the firstborn among many brothers. So in 3 dimensions of time, and plus 3 dimensions, God's foreknowing and predestining can be one and the same. God has the capacity to view every event along our timeline from a single instant, and from that same instant to generate cause and effect phenomena anywhere along that timeline. God can, in a moment of his time, cause events to happen before, during, and after the roughly 13.799 billion years history of our universe. So literally, before the universe existed, before our 1 dimensions of time existed, God had access to every event in the history of the cosmos and every action, word, and thought that every human would ever experience throughout his or her life. So, the crucial question remains, how does God do the predestining while guaranteeing us the freedom of our will? How does God predetermine every choice without infringing on our control over the human choice vectors depicted in these schematic diagrams? The answer is that God can see not only what occurs throughout a person's life, but also the events and conditions, which is physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually, in which things occur. Each of us expresses our will in response to complex internal and external factors. Knowing all these factors, including the characteristics of our personality, the effects of our experiences and communications with people, and even with the spiritual forces in the unseen realm, God anticipates the direction of each choice and how strongly we will express our will in any instance. So God could prescribe the exact conditions to generate the response of our will at any given moment that fits into his total plan. Notice, at the end of the day, it's his total plan. Again, a gospel-focused or Christ-centered biblical theology, this should be the ultimate argument that Cameron should be making. We would remain continuously in control of our will, while God would continuously control the circumstances and conditions in and around us that impact our will. So the bottom line is that we cannot expect to be able to form an adequate picture in our minds of how human choice and divine choice can both be fully operational. But if we accept both truths because God's trans-dimensional and extra-dimensional powers demonstrate the possibility of making sense of them, we can experience both the challenge and comfort we need to live as God's children. We need the challenge of responsibility for our choices, just like the man who was negligent in his, with his children in the car, right? So we need the challenge of responsibility for our choices. And we also need the comfort of comprehending, even to a limited degree, how all those things, including our unwise choices that impact our lives, can work together for good for the accomplishment of God's ultimate purpose and plan. Hence the famous verse in Romans 8, God works all things for good, right? Now, okay, so I'll this is, by the way, I'll bring up this Cruel World text by the astrophysicist Hugh Ross in his book Marrow Days, but I'll deal with this later on in my review of Cameron's message here.
Building. And the name of this one is actually, it'd probably be better if the name of this was changed to something like virtue acting. Virtue acting. This reason basically says that acts of virtue like love, forgiveness, compassion, sacrifice, these are worth the suffering in the world. Acts of virtue are the greatest possible goods. And just think about it for a moment. Can you think of something that is greater than these acts of love, like forgiveness, like compassion? And notice, suffering is actually necessary to do these acts of virtue. It's necessary. Has anyone seen the movie Endgame in here? It's probably going to be mainly young people. Endgame. So this is a movie where a guy named Tony Stark, he sacrificed himself for who knows how many billions of people. He sacrificed himself. He endured quite a bit of suffering. The point, though, is that acting out virtue literally entails or requires suffering. We're about to turn to a video. In the video we're about to watch, we're going to witness one of the greatest acts of virtue that anyone can ever do. And this always gives me chills every time I watch this. It's a movie, or not a movie. It's a clip about radical forgiveness. Let's watch.
An emotional courtroom as the victim's father.
So basically, here's the courtroom case, and then the father. So this guy here, he forgives the murder of his son, and then they, basically they hug it out. The murderer gets quite emotional, and yeah. But here's the thing. Here's an example of reconciliation, which again is a very human thing. How do you marry this to, say, the gospel and God? This is again my frustration. These are good, very good human. I mean, obviously the guy is a Muslim, so there is a potential for a religious, like a psychological bent because of a certain religious perspective on things, right? But the point is, someone like the murderer, his response to this very unexpected moment and reaction of the victim's father, notice how that just tears down strongholds. And here's a moment where Cameron should jump on the opportunity of the tearing down, of this notion of chaos kampf, this stronghold, this, death, where is your sting? Grave, where is your victory? That sort of language. Which again, notice the gospel, the central message of the gospel is that it is the answer to the pain and suffering and everything. So Cameron's going to use this as an example, and then he just leaves it hanging. It's just like, oh, by the way, there's an example of a human moment. Yeah, it's beautiful. How does that, again, you need to bridge that to ultimately Jesus. So here we go.
News in Lexington. Lindsay Piercy, LEX 18 News.
Every time I watch this clip, I just want to stop and just think about how awesome that is. It's so valuable. These acts of love like this.
I agree.
Let's now turn and talk about what the Bible has to say about virtue. In Romans 5, 3 through 4, it says this: "We rejoice in our sufferings because we know that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance, character, and character, hope." The Bible says we're literally supposed to rejoice in our sufferings because suffering produces character, it produces hope. Now, despite the reasons that we've covered so far, it could be the case that some cases of suffering nevertheless remain utterly mysterious. And in these cases, I think it's actually best to exercise humility. Christian philosopher Alvin Plantinga, that's a guy you definitely need to look up if you've never heard of him.
Okay, now, do you see, for the rest of the video, he's not going to go back to Romans 5. So, let's, oops, I meant to keep that up. Let's bring in some examples here. And I'll also bring up, say, you're right. Okay, is this coming up clear? You guys just let me know if this is clear. It should be clear. So the passage, if I go back to Cameron's, let's see. Okay, so we rejoice in our sufferings because we know that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance character, and character hope. All right. Now, this is not a biblical argument. This is a common, proverb or an idiom that Paul, as a Second Temple Jew, and not only that, but a Hellenized Jew, because in Greco-Roman literature you find this sort of thing. Because humans know about this. So from afflictions to patient endurance to proven character to then hope, and then the cycle continues on and on and on, because like suddenly there's no more afflictions. Oh, the next day there's afflictions. There's brand new afflictions. And then the fight continues until the end of the day, bang, hope. Afflictions again. It's this constant rinse and repeat. Okay? Now this is from it's a very cool commentary by Stephen. Okay, I think I'm breaking up. What Cameron should have done was go to the next example in that Romans passage. So when you actually read that Romans passage, so I'll just zoom in over here. Yeah. Not only that, but we also boast in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, endurance produces character, and character produces hope. Now notice this. He stops. When you go to the video clip, Cameron just stops at verse 4. Cameron, if you're going to be speaking in a church, again, my frustration is your engagement with the Bible is just not even, it's like if I was to compare it to like full cream milk and skim milk, like your approach is skim milk light. It's like, it makes skim milk like full cream milk. Make it gospel focused and biblically focused, because the next couple of verses get right down to it. It actually, this is Paul's fulcrum point in one of his greatest magnum opuses, and that is the book of Romans, where he's like, look, now this hope does not disappoint us. Because God's love has been even at the back of my mind, I have the realization that one day I'm just going to pass off the scene. Um, but no, Paul is emphasizing that no. This hope doesn't disappoint us. It's not a disappointing hope. Because think about it, in an atheist framework, someone like, those deduction points, like if God exists, there's no pointless suffering, but there is pointless suffering. Because again, in that atheistic worldview, it's just that perspective. So using to bridge to the atheist, in this case an atheist, especially in the ancient world, an atheist doesn't mean he didn't believe in God. It just means he had no association with, say, God. He had no, like, it doesn't mean he's saying I don't believe it exists. It's just that I have no psychological basis or means to have any thought or relation or even to think about or contemplate or reflect on or to align with, even entertain as a theoretical data point. That was an atheist. Um, so Paul's saying all of us deduce generally because of life. We deduce verses 3 and 4, right? But the Christian message is, whether you like it or not, and it's not, and that's another thing. It's not whether you like it or not, although that is the case. Because because think about it, whether you like it or not, Jesus came and did what he did, right? But I want to say whether you like it or not in the sense of that it's a good whether you like it or not. It's not like some terrible thing. It's actually the most grandest thing, whether you like it or not. And that is, say if you were ignorant about what happened in Christ, right? Say if you're ignorant about the gospel message, the fact is, it's already been done. So what Jesus accomplished is that it's a hope now. So to some it may come across as surprising, like, what? That actually happened for my sake and I had no clue about it? That's a possibility. But again, the point is, Jesus did it whether you like it or not. He came and did it, right? So now this hope does not disappoint us. Why? Powerless. There's that. Notice that significant cosmic. Paul is in quick succession is giving very, like each word, and scholars bring this out in the Roman commentaries. Each word now is like this. It's like this crescendo of where you can write a 1,000-page book on each of these words. Like each word in itself is a corpus of literature can be written on them. So for just the right time, my gosh, you can write so much on that. While we were still powerless, you can write so much on that. Christ, so the Messiah, died. For who? The ungodly? And then he makes a deduction. He's like, for it is rare for anyone to die for a righteous person, though somebody might be brave enough to die for a good person. But God demonstrates his love. That is the issue here with respect to the topic of pain and suffering and evil in this world. He demonstrates his love for us by the fact that the Messiah died for us while we were still sinners. Right? And in fact, Paul emphasizes it even more. He's like, while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God through the death of his Son. How much more, having been reconciled, in all of this? Paul, being a very good biblical, scripture-focused Jew, and this is why the importance of biblical exegesis and where theology matters, he brings it full circle that it's not our boasting, right? We can boast. See, we also boast in our sufferings and so on and so on. And reconciled. That, you see, it comes full circle. That is the gospel. And that's how the topic should be addressed. Now, what I want to do is I want to play a clip from N.T. Wright on this passage in Romans. Let me just bring it up.
There are some passages in Paul, and Romans 5, 1-11 is one of them, where we have a kind of rhetorical effect that I think of as being a bit like a rosebud. We start with this very tight-packed little statement, and if you go into your garden and look at a rosebud, it's a very small thing. You'd hardly believe just how much extraordinary foliage is packed into that little flower. And then, with the sun and the rain and all the rest of it, the rosebud opens up a bit and we say, oh, seems to be some more leaves in there. And then, days or weeks later, it's this huge great rose blossoming. And you say, how on earth could all of that been contained in that tiny little package to begin with? Now, Romans 5, 1 and 2 is like the original rosebud. That says the basic thing that Paul wants to say in 5, 1-11, and because 5, 1-11 is a microcosm of the whole argument of 5-8, as we saw, 5, 1 and 2 basically says it all. But of course we can't see it all yet. It's tight packed in there like the rosebud. And
okay, so this rosebud analogy that N.T. Wright's saying, so this is verses 1 and 2. Since we have been justified by faith, not of works. So Cameron, you'll have to reflect on this when you become a Catholic. We have peace with God through our Lord by faith into this grace by which we have been established, and we boast because of our hope in God's glory. Now, these two verses. But these two verses engage the issue with respect to a very relevant issue, which is this problem of evil stuff. All right. Now let's come back to N.T. Wright.
So he opens it out just a bit more. 5, 3, 4, and 5. And we see more. We say, oh my goodness, look at all that stuff there. And then 5, 6 to 11. It's a much larger, fuller rose, and we can gaze at it and inspect the individual petals. But they were all there in Paul's mind in that opening statement. They all then are drawing out the implications of chapters 1 to 4.
By the way, sorry for pausing it, but 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, when you say, I didn't know Rob was a presup, no, I'm not a presuppositionist. Presuppositional apologetics is, like, in my opinion, an abomination. So, yeah, I don't know if you were tongue-in-cheek joking, but yeah, I just want to confirm I'm not a presuppositionist.
And pointing ahead to the fuller statement that comes all the way through. The main theme, again, is assurance. The assurance that the verdict that has already been issued over faith will be repeated, will be ratified and fulfilled at last. But this isn't simply legal, it is also, as we've seen, cultic. As he says, we are justified by faith, we have peace with God, reconciliation. Through Jesus we have obtained access by faith to this grace in which we stand. This whole theme of being in the presence of the living God, like priests in the temple, only now allowed right into the Holy of Holies. This is the great theme which contextualizes everything else. And this, therefore, also points on to what he says at the end of verse 2, we boast or rejoice in the hope of the glory of God. And as we've seen, the glory of God is for the Jew in the first century that great hope from Isaiah 40 and so on, that all flesh shall see the glory of God, that one day the glory will come back and all flesh shall see it together. And when Paul says in Colossians 1:27 that Christ is in you as the hope of glory, I think that's what he has in mind, that the Messiah lives in the congregations of his people, lives by his Spirit with them, and that is the pointer to the fact that one day the earth as a whole shall be full of the glory of God as the waters cover the sea, echoing Isaiah, echoing Habakkuk. That is the great hope which comes to its fruition in Romans chapter 8. And I think already here we see Paul hinting at it. We are boasting in the hope of the glory of God, the hope of being renewed humans in whom the living God has come to dwell, through whom the living God will exercise his wise redemptive sovereignty over his wounded and waiting creation. But then this immediately takes us into verses 3, 4, and 5, where the rosebud opens a bit more, spells out the meaning. Not only so, we also boast, rejoice in our sufferings. Paul has taken the theology of the cross, which he's expounded briefly so far, and has shown here, and will show much more fully in Romans 8, that suffering somehow, strangely, is part of the Christian vocation, is part of the means by which this glory is revealed in the present and will be brought to birth in the future.
Do you notice now just how beautiful N.T. Wright's point was just then? Do you see where if you were to engage the topic of the problem of evil, and I haven't heard Cameron mention this in his video, but just to go back a few seconds, this world of suffering is, in the mind of a Christian, right? Psychologically as well as ontologically, in the sense of like an actual thing, it's expected. Pick up your cross, right? It should not surprise a Christian that the world is governed by chaos kampf. Hence the hope that doesn't disappoint us, because we have a Savior and a God who not only is the creator of all this, and thereby we give all glory and honor to God, regardless of the type of creation that's been caused, right? Now we're talking here in that sovereign sense, the traditional sovereign way of worship. But at the same time, why do we worship, say in this case, Jesus? Because what if he turned out to be, say, a Gnostic Yahweh, like a tyrant? Would you worship Yahweh in that sense? No. Me personally, I wouldn't. I wouldn't worship a Gnostic, demiurge. So, therefore, how does God then reveal that he's not that evil demiurge of Gnosticism? And that is Paul's argument here in Romans 5. This language of love that's being demonstrated. So, I'm just wondering, hope this is not too laggy. So, I want to, before I continue with N.T. Wright, I'll bring up one of my favorite accounts, and that is from John Stott. It's a book he wrote back in 1986, and the title of the book is called let's see here. The title of the book is called The Cross of Christ. And let me just zoom in for the relevant. Okay. Now this is under the chapter, so this is near the end of John Stott's book, under the context of suffering and glory. Okay? And anyone who's a fan of John Stott will be familiar with where I'm going with this. Where he, let me zoom out of it. So he's talking about God's, it is a deep theological question about God's immutability. Like, can God suffer? Okay. Or can he somehow share in that suffering or something like that, right? So after a very long discussion, this is already page 334. This already 300 pages have tackled this very issue. And then finally John Stott concludes with these points, and he's like, look, let me see if I can go. Yeah, in fact, I'll just read from up here. So he goes, there is good biblical evidence that God not only suffered in Christ, but that God in Christ suffers with his people still. Is it not written of God during the early days of Israel's bit of bonding? Did not Jesus ask Saul of Tarsus why he was persecuting him, thus disclosing his solidarity with his church? It is wonderful that we may share in Christ's sufferings. It is more wonderful still. Now again, I just want to quickly reread this first bit again. It is wonderful that we may share in Christ's sufferings. Can you imagine God, like in this case, the Creator, saying, hey, can you drink the cup? Like, in fact, what Jesus says, when the disciples say, oh, I would like to be on your right and left side in the kingdom, on those thrones. And Jesus famously goes, guess what? You can't drink the cup that I'm about to drink. In other words, the sufferings of Christ, the cup of wrath that he was going to take on upon himself, which is ironically his means by defeating Chaos Kampf and all that. Jesus is saying, yeah, you won't be able to handle it. You can't. You're insignificant compared to who I am. But here's a Christian a moment in the way John started thinking theologically as a traditional Christian, that it's an honor then to have even a certain like just a tiny taste of sharing in the sufferings of Christ. Like what Paul says, imitate me as I imitate Christ. Like it's this sort of like this intimacy with your Savior and your Creator. So this is the sort of this this language. It's very ancient Christian language. This language of like, it is wonderful that we may share in Christ's sufferings, right? Okay, so that being said, he says something even more fascinating. It is more wonderful still. So yeah, it's wonderful that we can share, but it's more wonderful still that he shares in ours. Truly, his name is Emmanuel, God with us. But his sympathy is not limited to his suffering with his covenant people. Did Jesus not say that in ministering to the hungry and thirsty, the stranger, the naked, the sick, and the prisoner, we would be ministering to him? Notice that. Ministering to the hungry, thirsty, stranger, naked, sick, prisoner, all those things I saw in the Philippines. When we are part of that, in that surrounding and in that ontological parameter of chaos Kampf in that Philippine context, and it's not just the Philippines, by the way, it could be anywhere. The interesting thing is that ultimately we're ministering back to Jesus and God, because it's this synergistic, it's this communication, it's this relationship. So we would be ministering to him, indicating that he identified himself with all needy and suffering people. And then here's the famous, once he's made that point, now this is his famous doxology, John Stott's doxology, where he's, if it were not for the cross, the only God. Okay, now hear me out. What I'm about to say may sound quite cold, but I'm not neglecting. I'm not downplaying this next point. When Cameron brings up the issues of the problem of evil and natural evil, and like say the Boxing Day tsunami or whatever, or the father, his children dying in the car, or the murderer killing that father's child, and yes, those are whole exceedingly horrible bad things. I'm not downplaying them at all. But the Bible says that the cross is the culmination of all of that. It's not that the cross is like bigger than those things, so therefore we ignore those things. No. No, that's not what I'm saying, or what John Stott's saying here. What the biblical message is that, and what the gospel message is that all of those situations are pieces of that grand cosmic moment, which is the cross of Christ. That is the Christian message. Then you can extend that out into how I started this review with the biodeposits, 70 plus quadrillion tons of biodeposits, which means you're talking about trillions upon trillions of death for the last 4 billion years. It's just it's such a crazy number. It just becomes just a number on the page. You can't fathom just how much death has transpired over 4 billion years. But again, the Christian message is that all of that culminates with respect to the cross. That is John Stott's ultimate argument. I could never myself believe in God if it were not for the cross. The only God I believe in is the one Nietzsche ridiculed as God on the cross. In the real world of pain, how could one worship a God who was immune to it? There's a key word here, immune. How could you worship a God who's immune to it? I've entered many Buddhist temples in different Asian countries and stood respectfully before the statue of the Buddha. His legs crossed, arms folded, eyes closed, the ghost of a smile playing around his mouth, a remote look on his face, detached from the agonies of the world. But each time after a while I've had to turn away, and in imagination I've turned instead to that lonely, twisted, tortured figure on the cross, nails through hands and feet, back lacerated, limbs wrenched, brow bleeding. From thorn pricks, mouth dry, and intolerably thirsty, plunged in God-forsaken darkness. That is the God for me. He laid aside his immunity to pain, entered our world of flesh and blood, tears and death. He suffered for us. Our sufferings become and okay. When you have this language of he suffered for us, how interesting, right? Everything, just this shared, common human experience. It's like, the very creator himself, who's created this entire reality, is the one sharing in that as well. And so then, and what's the logical deduction after that? That so-called pointless, the pointless sufferings that supposedly exist, right? Yeah, he also shared in that. And therefore, our sufferings become more manageable in the light of his. And so, yes, there is still a question mark against human suffering. But over it, we boldly stamp another mark, the cross, which symbolizes divine suffering. This bit here is Paul's theology in Romans. Divine suffering. I'm just wondering, am I still live? Can you guys still hear me? Just wondering because about comments like, I think we have a deadite or something. So let's bring back
and will show much.
Let's bring back into your right. Okay, here we go.
More fully in Romans 8, that suffering somehow, strangely, is part of the Christian vocation, is part of the means.
See again, it's part of the Christian vocation. If you're a Christian, the so-called philosophical conundrum, Hume's thing and problem of evil and suffering, and I just have to laugh at that question. It's like Christians are like, biblical Christians would be like, well, duh. That's just the fact of reality, and but let me give you a message that showcases why that's the case to begin with, and where it's heading to, because we're not alone in this. We have company. We have a purpose in this whole thing. It's not pointless suffering. It's a suffering that's leading somewhere, and then the suffering in itself, we were powerless to overcome. God's the one that provides a way out. through Jesus.
By which this glory is revealed in the present and will be brought to birth in the future. It's as though those who follow Jesus are, as it were, caught between the old age and the new, where the two are chafing together, and those who follow Jesus are caught within that chafing, and sometimes it's extremely painful, either mentally or emotionally or often physically, and every generation has had its martyrs and its persecuted church, but also Christians who in less dramatic ways have found following Jesus incredibly difficult and painful for whatever reason. And so Paul says, this isn't just an accident, it's actually part of belonging to the Messiah's people. And here's how it works, he
Keyword, this is not an accident.
says. We know that suffering produces patience. The word he uses for produce is to work, or to work within, or to work through. It's as though God is doing things which transform us, because 5-8 is all about being transformed by the gospel. Suffering produces patience. Patience produces character, the quality of a character that has been tried and tested and is proving true. And character produces hope. And hope, he says, does not disappoint us, does not make us ashamed, because the love of God has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who's been given to us. Here's the first mention within the full argument of the letter of the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit's given so that the hearts of God's people can be transformed. And what is this love of God? There's a long debate about this, because in a few verses' time, Paul is going to talk about God's love for his people. God commends his love for us in that while we were sinners, the Messiah died for us. But what sense would it make to think of that love somehow being poured or concentrated into our hearts? I think myself it's much more likely that Paul is here balancing out two things, and that here in verse 5 he's talking about our love for God. Because, after all, we've already referred to the Shema prayer in Judaism. The Lord, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and mind and soul and strength. And I think what he's saying is that hope doesn't disappoint us, because we have within ourselves, within our hearts, that love for God, which is the sign that we are really the Shema people. We are the ones who are loving God, who are honouring him, who are invoking his kingdom. You see the same at the end of chapter 8, because in 8:28 he talks about those who love God and all things working together for good for them or through them. But then in 8:31-39 he again talks about God's love for us. It's the same balance, and it seems to me he's quite deliberately keeping that in order to talk, of course, about the sovereign love of God, but within that, the transformation which comes when through the Spirit people learn to love God in return, and hence find that suffering produces patience, and patience produces character, and character produces hope. So that's 5:1-5, which is the microcosm of what is then to follow and is the signpost on towards chapter 8. But this is all then explained by verses 6-11.
All right. Now notice, I just want to re-emphasize. When Cameron brings up that passage, especially in a Christian church context, he just leaves it hanging. He just moves on to the next point. Again, this is my frustration with just his bare bones engagement with the text. As you can see here in a moment, Wright's now going to go, yeah, all that build up, and then Cameron doesn't follow through with it. Here's the key part. This is where Cameron should have gone if he was going to refer to Romans 5 in light of the topic at hand.
This is actually the fullest and longest statement anywhere in Romans of the meaning of Jesus' death and its results. People often try to put so much weight on Romans 3:24-26 that they don't realize that this is actually the place where Paul spells it out in detail. And his main point is that the death of Jesus reveals the love of God. We cannot say it too often that it is completely wrong to imagine that what's going on is an angry God and Jesus coming along to be nice to us as though to pacify the Father who is otherwise going to remain angry. The whole point about the death of Jesus is that this is the free gift of God. God commends his love towards us, he says, in that while we were sinners, the Messiah died for us. And please note, it makes no sense at all to say, I love you so much, I'm going to send someone else to die for you, to do the really nasty bit. That sentence about God's love being shown in the Messiah's death only makes sense if, as in fact we know from many other passages in Paul, Paul sees the Messiah as himself, the one who is from the very heart of God. We don't have good language for it. Later centuries invented Trinitarian language of the formulaic kind. Paul talks about the Father sending the Son, and it's clear that the Son is one who from all eternity was the very expression of the Father's heart and love. So that when humans fell and when humans sinned and messed totally up, then it didn't require, as it were, something strange or extra from God. What it required was the same overflowing, generous love by which creation came to be in the first place. Paul builds up to...
Notice that. The same love and volition and choices and plans to even start all of this to begin with has its goal in this thing that happened in Jesus. Why? Because it goes back to Leibniz. It goes back to the best of all worlds. It goes back to that issue of, well, I have a philosophical problem here. I can't create another Yahweh. I can't create a universe that's perfect like me. Because to create a perfect thing like me, to create Yahweh means Yahweh has to be created. How? But then this Yahweh number 2 can't be perfect because it's created. Because I'm uncreated. Like, it all starts from there. So that you have this emergence of reality. What's natural to the system is unnatural to him. What's natural to him is unnatural to the system. But then, what's natural to the system is the reason why the system, when I say system here, I mean this created thing, which is the universe. The system will deteriorate into gloomy, chaos-ridden death and oblivion. So God's like, that's obviously its end result, because it's a created thing. I'm going to come in and in hypostasis transform it to my level. That's the incarnation, that's the cross, and that's the resurrection. All of that working out in his sovereign plan. Now, in between the creation, which is 13.8 billion years ago, and all that stuff that leads, we're talking evolution, we're talking all the biodeposits, and because don't forget, ironically, we need those biodeposits to even make civilization and to do what we need to do. And then us as a species, as a result of that evolution. So I'm thinking of like something like Psalm 8, when David's like, when I look to the heavens and I count the stars, and I'm just like having an existential moment of how grand all of this is and how insignificant I am. So why do you even take notice of me? I could add on top of that what David's saying, and I could say, yeah, not just the vastness of things, but even my local suffering. It's like still, it's puny, it's tiny, it's insignificant in light of who he is. But at the same time, what does the Psalm say in Psalm 8? But you've taken notice, and you've made us, in your sovereign will, you've made us to be rulers to rule creation, to basically to be, you know, in your throne room, so to speak. But we are nothing. And then when you go into, say, the Michael Heiser Divine Council side of things, you start to realize that, okay, that's just from David's limited picture, his perspective. So when you go into, say, Psalm 82 and the Divine Council stuff, now the picture becomes a lot bigger, because guess what? David, which is down over here, having this moment. Okay, he's having that moment. But then other passages speak about how the perspective enlarges a bit, because now you have a Psalm 82 Divine Council drama and added layer of things going on. So, notice it's to use the analogy of say Thor. You have Odin, Thor, Loki. In the Marvel movies, and then you have Earth, which is down here, and Asgard is up there. Odin wants to marry Asgard and Earth. But in that process, Earth, which is this place of nothingness in comparison to, say, Asgard, and all the humans on Earth, they're caught in the crossfire of that drama that's going on at that other higher layer. Right? So that's again that's the significance of the gospel in light of pain and suffering as an issue. We're caught in the crossfire of a huge cosmic discussion between God and the gods. And out of everything that has been created in this reality, God, and that's the Psalm 8 moment, God, we have become the apple of his eye. We have caught his attention. We are now in his focus. The John 3:16 moment, for God so loved the world. And God chose to incarnate into us as a species. Why not some other creature? Why humans? That's, again, when you put the gospel in that perspective, that becomes an existential, like, wow, that is a huge, huge claim. That is unbelievable. Therefore, as John Stott would say, our sufferings become manageable in light of his on our behalf. He chose us. So, okay, let's continue and finish off with Anti-Right.
Verse 8, where he says that about the love of God, by verses 6 and 7, where he points out that this happened at the right time. It's like Galatians 4:4, when the fullness of time had come. But he says, Christ died for the ungodly. That's the same word that you find in Romans 1:18, where it's the primary charge. This is the thing that's wrong, that people have abandoned God, and yet God sends the Messiah to die for them. And then in verse 7 he says, think about it, one will hardly die for a righteous, upright person. And then he corrects himself, perhaps for a good man one might dare even to die. It's as though he's just musing on the side there. But then he says, God commends his love for us in that he's done something much, much harder than that. While we were yet sinners, the Messiah died on our behalf. And then in the next couple of verses, he adds to that again. We were weak, we were ungodly, we are sinners. We would never do this. God's love, in other words, only makes sense when you look at it like that, if God is present in the Messiah, redeeming the world. In 2 Corinthians 5:19, Paul says, God was in the Messiah, or in the Messiah God was reconciling the world to himself. And so verses 9 and 10, Paul summarizes 3:21 to 26. He says, since therefore we are justified now in his blood. That seems to be a way of scrunching together the whole argument of 3:21 to 26. And if we are justified by his blood, we shall be saved, he says, from the wrath which is to come. That wrath is future. In other words, the justification in chapter 3 is not the dealing with wrath, but because we are justified by his blood, because the blood has covered the mercy seat and God has met with us in grace, we then will be saved from all that lies ahead, as in chapter 2, verses 1 to 11.
I just want to emphasize another key point about that as well. When you go back to chapter 3, since Antichristo has brought it up, here's another very key passage that tackles this issue of pain and suffering, where the cross demonstrates God is not a hypocrite. He would be a hypocrite if there was no cross. That's a pretty bold statement, right? So here we go. Notice this. So there's a famous verse in verse 23, we've all sinned, continue to fall short of the glory of God. Keep through the redemption that is in Jesus, right, which God offered as a place for atonement by the Messiah's blood through faith. Now notice this. He, God, did this, God did the crucifixion to demonstrate his righteousness. The cross demonstrates God's righteousness. And not just because he had waited patiently to deal with sins committed in the past. Instead, he wanted to demonstrate at the present time that he himself is righteous and that he justifies anyone who has the faithfulness of Jesus. So then what is there then to boast about? All right, that has been eliminated. On what principle? On that of actions? No. But on the principle of trust, faith, pistis, trust. Faith. And so we maintain that the person is justified by faith apart from the actions prescribed by the law, and on it goes. So again, a gospel-centered message is vital for tackling this issue of pain and suffering.
This points on then to chapter 8, verses 1 to 4, where he talks about no condemnation, no final condemnation, because sin has already been condemned. And this is the meaning of salvation. Justification leads to salvation. The two are not the same. Justification is God's declaration, his judicial, covenantal declaration that these are my people, these are the sin-forgiven ones. Salvation is the ultimate rescue from sin and from death itself, the rescue from all that would corrupt and deface and destroy. The two, of course, eventually meet and merge in the resurrection, but in Paul's arguments, it's very important to keep them separate. And so he says, the final explanation, and often when Paul is explaining and then explaining and explaining, the last bit of explanation is the deepest and richest point of all. So in verse 10, if when we were enemies, we were reconciled to God through the death of his Son, much more now that we are reconciled, shall we be saved in his life. There are all sorts of passages in Paul, in the Psalms, in the prophets, which bring together righteousness and life. Paul said it himself, the righteous shall live by faith. And here we see how that works out. In verse 10, we were reconciled. That goes with the peace with God. In verse 1, we are reconciled to God through the death of his Son. And therefore, now that God has done the hard bit of the process, of course, he will now do the easy bit, the wonderful bit, the glad and rejoicing bit. You see exactly the same line of thought in 8:31 to 39. God did not spare his own Son, but gave him up for us all. How much now will he freely with him give us all things? Not only so, says Paul in verse 11, but we boast, rejoice, celebrate. How are we going to translate it? That's not easy. We boast in God. That is an extraordinary claim in chapter 5, verse 11.
Yeah, again, I just want to. That's such a beautiful point. Again, he's making, like, again, it's in Romans. If he's already given his Son, what else is there needed in light of the situation? Again, coming back to the problem of evil, suffering, pain. It is incredible.
That's what he says that people were trying to do in chapter 2, verses 17 following. But he says we celebrate in God through our Lord Jesus the Messiah, through whom we have now received this reconciliation. This is a way of saying this God is our God. And please note, that claim can never be arrogant, because it is made solely on the basis of the grace of God in the death of Jesus, and solely in the teeth of the fact that the people who make that claim are the ones who are following the Messiah in the suffering and in the life of service, which is what Paul will go on to describe in Romans 8. There is,
by the way, this comment by Sushi, you basically nailed it. The Bible is far more clearer in describing the problem of evil and redemption than any Christian philosopher trying to solve this. Scriptures are indispensable tools for Christians. Yep, I agree. And by the way, this is again, it goes back to my frustration. Hopefully it can be taken as a form of encouragement. But Cameron, if you're listening to this, for goodness sake, just do more Bible. Yeah, deductive arguments by the philosophical whims of, the people that you cite. It's like the blind leading the blind. I hate to put it that way, but when you have, especially as a Christian, when you have this as your, if you're soaked in this, everything falls into place. Not the so-called what ifs in philosophical jargon, in philosophical, like a logician's deductive, because there's just so many logical deductions that you can make, right? But they're, at the end of the day, deductions. How do you marry that to reality? You can't. Because at the end of the day, when you have the philosophers on one side, but then you have the actual hard data and the science on the other. That's where I am. And in the case of the biblical data point, again, it comes back full circle. Theology matters. Sola Scriptura matters. This is how you should be engaging the topic, especially to a non-Christian audience.
It's of course a danger, as there always has been in the Christian church, that we tip over and we make this a triumphalist thing, and we think we've made it, we're the ones. And Paul has harsh words to say about.
Oh, just to clarify, Ringo Cat, gonna have to watch this from the start as Rob. No. I love N.T. Wright. I'm actually giving a. I'm making a response to capturing Christianity and Cameron on the topic of the problem of evil. I'll get back to his video in a moment. But I'm using, because Cameron brought up Romans 5, I'm using N.T. Wright as a simultaneous sort of virtual discussion here between what I'm saying and what Wright's saying, and yeah, I just wanting to bridge that point.
About that kind of attitude later on in the letter. The only safe way is to keep looking at the love of God in the death of Jesus, and at the call then, as Jesus himself said, to take up one's cross to follow. And only when one is looking like that and holding on like that can one then say, we celebrate in God through Jesus the Messiah our Lord.
So, in other words, yes, Jesus, I will take up my cross, but I can only take up my cross because you've loved me. And it's not that I'm taking up my cross because you've demonstrated that to me, and so therefore it's like, okay, I'll do it. There are moments where I'm too weak to even be able to. I may, in that weakness, there's many forms of weakness. It could be I'm too scared to. It could be I could be blind to it, or I could be unwilling, or I could be like actually weak, where I need help. In other words, I want to, but I can't. So when this language of God's love, that triune love, as a reminder, the interesting thing is that God, through Jesus, with respect to the cross that he endured and carried, he's picking it up with me. And that's the journey, and then it's a lifelong journey. He's like, hey, you're not alone when you pick up the cross. Yeah, pick up the cross. You know, in this case, endure Chaoskampf, endure the struggle. But you're not alone. Because guess what? You can't, at the end of the day, defeat it. Because you're part of it. I am, at the end of the day, your creator. But I don't want you to be lost into an oblivion because of this situation with respect to the ontological attributes of creation. Because I love you, because at the end of the day I'm your creator, I've become this to then overrule it, to cause theosis, and you can actually have fulfilling, or a timeful and a fulfilling life, how you're meant to experience it in me. And that is the solution to the whole issue of pain, suffering, evil, blah blah. Let's, since I'll stop that video. What I'll do is, in a moment, I'll bring up the issue with respect to Job in a moment, and but I'll leave that for now. Like I'll bring it up in the discussion. I'm just setting it up. So let's go back to Cameron.
The Bible says we're literally supposed to rejoice in our sufferings because suffering produces character. It produces hope. Now, despite the reasons that we've covered so far, it could be the case that some cases of suffering nevertheless remain utterly mysterious. And in these cases, I think it's actually best to exercise humility. Christian philosopher Alvin Plantinga, that's a guy you definitely need to look up.
Okay, now do you see now when Cameron says, yes, it's all mysterious, you know, and but then he just leaves it at that. The point is that I agree there's a sense of mysteriousness to it, but it's not forever. I mean, if you were to try and put, the word mysterious into like a scale or something. Let's just say, before we got into this whole topic, let's just say it's 100% mysterious. The interesting thing is, if you chip away, the scriptures and the theology showcase a chipping away where it becomes 99% mysterious, then 98, then 97, then 96, and it keeps dropping. Because Jesus, in the focus of the question, the mystery of the issue of pain and suffering, Jesus is forever at the forefront as being the answer and the solution.
Up, if you've never heard of him, Alvin Plantinga, planting like planting a tree and then just an A on the end. He says it like this: given that God is omniscient and given our very substantial limitations, it isn't at all surprising that his reasons for some of what he does or permits completely escapes us. All right, let's put the picture of Magnus Carlsen on the screen. Is there anyone in here who knows who this guy is? It's difficult to see hands with the lighting, but nobody. Okay. All right, so he's a Norwegian chess grandmaster. He's the reigning 5-time world chess champion. But if you're not into chess at all, some of the moves that a grandmaster is going to make might seem kind of puzzling to you. It might seem kind of weird. But does the fact that you don't know why they made their last moves, does that mean that they couldn't possibly have a reason for making that move? No. Exercise some humility and acknowledge that you don't know everything. Isaiah 55, 8 through 9.
Yeah, but then again, notice what you've just done, Cameron. I don't disagree with that. No, because notice you are now at the 25-minute mark, and you've made up this big build-up. It's like the issue of how do we engage this issue of pain and suffering. And don't forget, because we are Christians and we're talking the Christian context. At the end of the day, we don't really know. So shut up and keep trusting in Jesus and God, and everything will fall into place. Do you see why I'm frustrated? If you engaged by saying, look, there's a positive, very beautiful, very rich, and real, an actual real solution, which is this thing that happened with Jesus, and then the theology that builds up as a ramification of that thing that happened, all the so-called mysteries, questions, and so on become a moment of like, for Christians especially ancient Christians, it becomes like this treasure hunt of, okay, the mystery of this, of suffering and pain and evil. It's a mystery still, but now we have a tool, Jesus, as a key to now unlock these mysteries and follow through with understanding why all of this even is the way it is. Basically, in other words, why the universe is the way it is. So in other words, without Christ, without Scripture, without the Bible and so on, it's just a very intimidating mystery. And there are people in this world that have, in that God-forsaken darkness, like a Psalm 22 moment, my God, why have you forsaken me? Like that sort of feeling, which, by the way, Jesus experienced on the cross, where in that certain loneliness, they've had to find tiny pieces of that mystery, or find solutions, very tiny solutions to the tiny pieces of that mystery in their own way. And then you have an accumulation, a build up, and so on. And kudos to those people that have spent their lives, sacrificed their lives for the pursuit of truth in that sense. In my opinion, God would honor them, because the interesting thing is they are actually performing a Christian duty even if they don't realize it. But notice, when the focus turns to the reality of the cross, that's not an intimidating mystery anymore. It's a mystery that we grasp um, in wonder and in excitement. Because why should we fear? You know, if ultimately it all comes down to Jesus and the cross and so on. So just notice that answer you just given is it's just very shallow. It's like, oh, at the end of the day, because Swinburne said it, which again I respect Swinburne, but still, it's this language of using the analogy of the chess game and the grandmaster. I get all that, but now you've just left it at, okay, don't ask any more questions, or it gives the impression of don't ask any more questions, because now we can't answer. We can never answer it gives that impression, and I'm suggesting that wasn't Paul's attitude whatsoever. Paul is systematically going, here's a theological model I'm presenting, in this case Romans, from A to Z, and Romans 5 is like the tipping point. It is the central, like literally that is the middle of the book, so to speak, theologically, and then the rest follows through. Chewie just nails it as usual. He says, with Christ, the problem of evil goes from mystery, in the sense of shrug, I don't know, to mystery in the sense of catastrophic explosion of one. That is perfectly said. Eucatastrophe. Tolkien's word eucatastrophe. Eucatastrophe is a it's a coined term by Tolkien. He coined it to mean a good catastrophe, a catastrophe that's actually a good, beautiful thing. It's a, but at the same time it's a surprising, like I didn't expect that. But at the same time it's something to rejoice in, even though it's a catastrophe. Okay, and where Tolkien was going along with this was basically imagine you are in the shoes of the disciples. You've just seen the catastrophe of the cross. But the resurrection is a eucatastrophe. It's like, what? In this Lord of the Rings, probably the best analogy would be at the end of, say, the third movie, where Frodo, so Gandalf and all those guys that are fighting, they're at the gates of Mordor and they're fighting those hordes, and they think they think they're the last stand. They don't know if Frodo's alive or not. In fact, they've just been told that Frodo's been killed. And the guy who's about to, I forget his name now, I think it's Aragorn. Someone in the chat will have to clarify his name, but he's like, I don't want to believe it. I don't want to believe Frodo is killed and dead. Because if he is, not only is the ring lost, or somewhere, but evil's not defeated, and guess what? That's it. We're the last, and we can be killed. And so, in that moment of despair, where all things, it's completely hopeless, and that's it. A eucatastrophe takes place. Basically, the eye and that tower starts crashing down. Obviously, they don't know what's just happened. Frodo's just thrown the ring and killed destroyed the ring. And then the moment of wonder on, say, Gandalf's face, like as he sees that eye coming down. Now notice that is a catastrophe taking place. A catastrophe of the destruction of evil. in light of the context of the fact that that is what causes pain and suffering in the Lord of the Rings context, and then that's being defeated, the eucatastrophe is the moment of, like what Tui is saying here. So how it's mysterious. How do we engage this tower and that eye? And now when we're actually seeing it, now it's a sense of a eucatastrophic explosion of wonder. It's like, wow, it's actually happening. I should not be, I don't feel intimidated anymore. I can carry my cross. And I just love in the movie, like, I just love how, you know, when they're all back together again, like when Frodo's in, you know, recovering in that bed, there's this joyful laughter that takes place. You know, Gandalf is standing there, all the other hobbits coming, and they're all having a laugh, and Gandalf is having a laugh, and you know, it's that little bit of that moment of, you know, how it should be. In no matter where you are in this world and what life you're living, in your own unique way, some blend of joyful, fruitful moment. It doesn't have to be like laughter doesn't, like, say if that moment doesn't have it laughter, it doesn't mean it's not a joyful, beautiful moment. Laughter is just one symptom or factor or facet of that, right? But the point is, you know, that's how it should be, and that's what God wants. That's the biblical message. God wants that moment, which could not have happened earlier in the movies. So, brilliantly said too. Yeah, and Christ revealing God in his death, right, changes everything. Yep.
For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts. Now, while I personally think that the reasons that I covered can actually account for any case of suffering, it wouldn't be surprising that some cases of suffering have justifying reasons that are just far beyond our ability to understand. And after all, God's ways, as we see in Isaiah, God's ways are far higher than our ways. His intellect is infinitely greater than our own. When it comes to the problem of evil, we should be ready to exercise some humility. All right, the last section. Let's move on to the last section. We'll move through this one pretty quickly. Is there a problem of evil?
Yeah, but again, just blurting out a quotation of Isaiah 55 still does nothing to bridge the person or the issue or whatever to a satisfactory solution. That's just a declaration. It's like, whoop-de-doo, God. Okay, your ways are higher than my ways. Have you done anything about Chaos Conf? Have you done anything about the problem of evil and suffering? Because if I don't see any action being done, you know, action speaks louder than words. Why should I trust you? You see, again, Cameron, bridge it to the cross. Bridge it to Jesus.
For atheists? I think the answer is yes, and it's probably going to be in a form that you haven't seen before. So we are optimists. Most people are optimistic about the world, including atheists. And by an optimist, I mean something very, very specific. An optimist believes the world is overall good and that we should be happy and grateful that we live in it. An optimist believes the world is overall good and that we should be happy and grateful that we live in it. Here's a quote from a famous atheist, Richard Dawkins. He says, quote, "We have cause to give thanks for our highly improbable existence and the law-like evolutionary processes that gave rise to it. Such gratitude is not owed to or to be directed towards anyone or anything." Nevertheless, he does have this sort of optimistic take on the world. Now, the question is this: how can one maintain optimism in the face of so much suffering in the world? Given the three reasons that I outlined just now, theists, or people that believe in God, are in a much better position to maintain optimism than atheists. If God exists, not only is there a loving being at the foundation of all reality, every case of suffering serves some greater purpose. But what can atheists actually appeal to? Can they appeal to greater purposes? No. On atheism, all that exists is material reality. They got nothing. They got nothing. And so theists are in a much better position to maintain optimism than their atheist counterparts. And
No, I disagree with that. Here's why. This is going to sound really, really radical here. But hear me out. It's kind of like an Ecclesiastes moment. When I was an atheist, and even now, like when I think back, now in hindsight of being a Christian and so on, I would be, and this is sort of being a bit judgmental, but I'm just being honest. Cameron, what you're sharing there about like, oh, Christians are theists, or they're more optimistic than non-theists. I'm sorry. I was very optimistic with the with just the wonders and the tools of the scientific enterprise and everything that was at my disposal growing up, educationally speaking, and the progress being made by by the hard work of men and women, not through religion, but just through hard work in the scientific field. Um, and then just nature itself. When you say, "Oh, we just have the materials," yeah, that's all we need. If you think about it, because that's all we do have anyway, right? When you go out camping, or when you meditate on just the beauty of everything, right? What I'm saying is sometimes atheists actually do have a more fulfilling optimism than a lot of religious people. There are a lot of religious people that might have more anxiety about God, issues, things with like hell, or I prayed for this didn't happen. Theological issues, let's say the Bible, whatever. Church conflicts, family relations. Religious people have way more problems, way more non-optimistic situations going on than non-religious people. In fact, I get along more with non-religious people than with religious people. I'm just being honest. Non-religious people are more, to put it, tongue-in-cheek and bluntly, non-religious people are more down to earth than religious people. They're more real. Now, Rob, am I being, you might say, Rob, are you being a bit hypocritical, or what, what's going on? Isn't it interesting that Jesus were with the non-religious crowd? Like, he got along more with the non-religious crowd than with the religious crowd? And hence the religious crowd was like, he's eating with tax collectors and prostitutes and drunkards. And you see, Cameron, when you make that comparison, that theists and religious people, and like they're more generally optimistic, no, because if you have a packaged systematized sort of theology, which ironically at the end of the day comes from man-made stuff, now you're falling into a non-reformed or a non-reforming packaged model that is stagnant in just that whatever era or moment that was packaged in, and then you ship it to someone. Jesus transcends that. So in other words, if I was to now talk to my atheist self, so if I went back in time now as a Christian and I were to converse with my atheist self, I would, again, this is why I hate labels. This is why, yeah, so just to summarize what I would say to myself, I would say, Rob, the irony is that approach that you're having is the approach Jesus had. It is a traditional Christian approach of constantly reforming, being quote unquote down to earth, being a realist. Because what then made me a Christian is not so much the problem of evil and my suffering and, all that stuff. Rather, the intriguing data point of death itself, which is the death of my Opa at the funeral. And if there is a God, what is his relation to this thing known as death? What's his solution? Because here's the ironic optimistic part on my atheist. When I was that atheist, here's my ironic optimistic perspective kicking in, because I accepted, keyword, accepted the fact that this is the way things are. So what intrigued me was, since I accepted that this is the way things are, can they become non the way things are? Can it sort of be like flipped? Like can the whole table be flipped over and be that the whole thing can be undone, where it becomes even better than what it is? I'm basically paraphrasing the gospel message. I've created all things new, right? Revelation 21. So now, from that certain optimism in my atheism, to then to have this realization that there is indeed a creator, and he goes, "Hey, hold my beer," because again, just to quickly show you directly a scriptural equivalent of my realization, and that is, which no one understood, not even the aeons of this world, sorry, the archons of this aeon, which would be Satan and his demons and so on. No one understood, because if they had, they wouldn't have killed Jesus, because killing Jesus is what and all this, right? And you see, that was sort of the moment I had. I was like, this is a lot grander than I've ever imagined. Even though I'm optimistic already, it's like, what? There's even more. So it's a sort of a humbling experience, really. The gospel message is like a humbling thing. So, yeah, that's why I would disagree with you. I would say there are a lot of people that have fulfilling lives. So how in that moment, how can you tell them, hey, yeah, you have a fulfilling life, but really you're not as optimistic as me, because really you're still empty, you're this, you're that, and you can't. Those people would just look at you and think, wow, you're a bit narcissistic and judgmental, and don't approach it that way. You're not going to win atheists to your message when you approach it that way. Yeah, I don't know what else to say on that, but let's continue and finish with this.
And I will close now with a quote from my favorite, or one of my favorite philosophers, Richard Swinburne. It is important what an agent does. It is more important what an agent does than what happens to him. Again, from Richard Swinburne. And this is my YouTube channel. You guys can actually pull out your phones right now, look up Capturing Christianity. It's okay to pull out your phones in church. Capturing Christianity. You can subscribe to my YouTube channel. I went a little bit longer than we planned. Do we have time for Q&A? Okay. All right, so we're about to do some Q&A now. Oh, thank you guys for, the talk is now over. Thank you.
It seems to be an ad.
I've got a
All right, so we have had a few questions come in. If you have questions, go ahead and text them in. The number's on the screen. Let's see, first question. I have a nephew who was raised in church, but like many these days, is very anti-church, to the point of extremely heated arguments. One Easter, our discussion led to the worst family Easter ever. This results in me wanting to avoid future family gatherings with him to prevent further pain and division. What should be my approach?
This is a great question, and I wish they would have been here on Friday night, because this is exactly what I talked about on Friday night. On Friday night, it was how to share your faith with skeptics. And one of the points that I made, the very first point that I made, was that you have to love people. Now, my brother, if you don't know my story, my brother became an atheist about 10 years ago, and that sent me on a journey into apologetics. And what I wanted to do, apologetics is just giving a rational defense of your faith. If you've never heard that term before. What I wanted to do, I found all sorts of evidence and arguments in favor of Christianity. When I discovered all of this, all I wanted to do was talk to him. And I even told him at one point, I was like, look, this is never going away. We're going to be arguing about this for the rest of our lives, is what I told him. And that was
Yeah. Now here's another thing. I'm not against the situations that may have arisen. I mean, at the end of the day, God's providence is at play in the sense of there's a certain growth for both of you in that moment, just as like it is for anyone, really, even myself included, and my own family members. But Cameron, this need to get into apologetics for the sake of trying to win people to Jesus is not the Great Commission. The Great Commission is making disciples. Now, what in a moment when you say, I just started to love him, which is again a key component in that, and I applaud you for doing that, instead of engaging your brother first, in that argumentative trying to win, that stuff. Again, the point is apologetics. I hate to say this. I mean, I run Sentinel Apologetics, but I'm thinking of apologetics in that traditional sense, like what the word actually meant. Now it's just become such an abused word. It's tarnished. The word is tarnished. When I see Christians engaging in quote unquote apologetics online, it's become like a sport, or it's become like a it's like used in debates to try and where it makes factions out of people, and the beautiful notion of the pursuit of the truth. Romans 12:1 and 2. This notion of logos worship, scientific worship by the renewing of your mind. A scientist wants to be wrong because that's the way a scientist's model grows. It keeps improving, gets ever closer to. It's kind of like a perfectionist attitude. It's like if forever it just keeps refining and refining and refining. Because Jesus is the ultimate truth. So, apologetics. Let me just bring up the famous verse that all Christians today use. Well, I should say misuse, really, because it appears over here in 1 Peter 3, verse 15. 15 when he says insolent. All right. Is Peter speaking about common modern day YouTube apologetics? The answer is no. Why? Because in the context of 1 Peter 3, okay, when he says love as chapter, do not pay others. Sorry, I just froze that. Don't forget, Peter's audience is to Jews during a diaspora, right? If you go all the way back to chapter 1, to the exile of the dispersion in, and all those are now expelled to, just before the 70 AD destruction of the temple, because now they're Christian. So this language of inheriting a blessing, these are all it's just very Jewish terminologies here, right? So Peter then quotes from evil, there's all practical stuff going on here. Yes, it's in the notice this point. It's in the context of persecution and suffering and pain. How ironic! The very topic that you're talking about, this issue of the problem of suffering and pain. It's in that context that you exalt Christ as Lord in your lives and give a defense to everyone as to why you have that hope in Christ through the pain and suffering. Do you see the point? The apologia, the so-called apologetic, is in, okay, you Christian, say if it was a pagan atheist or whatever, Greco-Roman pagan person, you are going through so many trials and tribulations and pain and suffering, and you claim to worship this deity that tells you, ironically enough, to pick up your cross and accept it and endure it. It's your vocation because your deity himself was on a cross. And that's the apologetic. The apologetic is to explain, in light of your sufferings, why you're a Christian. Right? And then, because it's a very normal human reaction to respond in a frustrated manner, because of that context, we'll be ashamed of slandering you. Right? And here's that suffering language again. After all, if it is the will of God, it is better to suffer for doing right than for doing wrong. But then he keeps continuing on. In light of the suffering. But don't forget, guys, remember, if it's better to suffer for doing right than doing wrong, remember, at the end of the day, Jesus also suffered. For sins once for all. Here is the apologetic. Here's the apologia in Enoch and the imprisoned spirits in Genesis 6 and all that stuff. So that's the context of apologia. That's the context of apologetics. Um, okay, to wrap it up, when you do apologetics or apologia about you and your relationship with Christ and your faith, for me, even though I call this sentinel apologetics, it's a personal thing. It's for my personal growth in Christ. And then when I do these streams, I'm sharing that discovery and that journey and that walk in Christ and my devotions in Christ and the Holy Scriptures to everyone out there. And then I just leave it up to them. Exactly the principle that Peter says here, keeping a clear conscience. Because it's up to them if they want to share in this or not. My apologetic is not, here's 100 proofs for God's existence. Now that I've given you 100 proofs for God's existence, you are, I'm sort of guilt shaming you into making a choice whether to believe in God or not. Okay, you've just given 100 proofs of God's existence. Whoop-de-doo. Even as an atheist, if I had 100, if God himself were to appear here, I'd be like, okay, God exists. Now what? The fact is he exists. That's it. Like, what can I do with that? There's no koinonia, there's no fellowship in that moment. It's a data point. Oh yeah, he exists. The theology in the text, as you can see over here, once you see the depth by which then that engages, okay, yeah, he exists. But there's just so much going on now that then there's a genuine koinonia, there's a discipleship occurs. The Great Commission actually takes place.
Was really silly of me to do actually at the time. Well, what I discovered eventually, after having the same exact experience, where I think it was on Thanksgiving one year, it was a terrible conversation, terrible time, where we got into a heated argument over dinner, and it was terrible. So what I did was I changed my strategy. Instead of having I was going into every conversation with my brother with the ulterior motive of I'm going to turn this into like a discussion about apologetics, about some argument for the existence of God. That was my ulterior motive in every single conversation. And what changed things finally was that I got rid of that ulterior motive, and my motive changed from that to just loving him. And I just focused on every interaction with him. I was loving him instead of trying to beat him up with an argument or show him how silly his beliefs were. Instead, I was going in and I was loving him. And that took a few years for us to actually then build back up a relationship after our relationship was founded on, or it wasn't founded on this, but it was bad for quite a while when I was going in with this ulterior motive. But when I went in with the motive of love, everything started to change. So that's what I would suggest to this person is change your motives, go in pure, stop having these ulterior motives, trying to have these conversations with somebody, just go in with love and then let it happen organically.
Yeah, amen to that last point. But again, a further encouragement: make it. This is my constructive criticism to you, and I feel that you don't do this enough. Make biblical exegesis and devotional theological engagement with respect to the gospel, right? Which is what I've been doing for the last 3 hours and 30 minutes. Make that a lifestyle. If you make that a lifestyle, that will speak wonders than some philosophical argument for God's existence or some, Gary Habermas resurrection fact. I'm not downplaying any of that stuff. They're just data points. So yeah, you're on the right track with approaching your brother in that sense of looking at him now first as your brother and as a common brother in humanity as well. You know, um, and in your case, as in a theological sense, as an imager of God. Um, Start with that first, and but for your own good and for your own sake, it's not selfish to do this. It's for your own good to make it a lifestyle, to become a text-focused, theologically driven, again, theology matters, a theologically driven Christian. Um, and then everything falls into place after that, in my opinion, because that's what worked for me.
Okay. In your interaction with scholars on this topic, are there any of them who have gone deep on the subject of Satan? Who are they? What do they say? Since the New Testament attributes some suffering to Satan and demons.
No, I have not actually looked into that. So this would actually be a good research topic for whoever this question is. Look into it, yeah, look into it yourself and see if there are any scholars that have written on that subject. But I personally have not. So,
all right.
So this is that another face palming moment. One of the key issues of the issue of pain, suffering, and death, and chaos kampf, and all that stuff, is in one of the main characters in the text. That's why the person has raised the question. Now, I know you might be going, oh boy, that's a huge mountain of data points to discuss in that short time frame and so on. You need not. You can keep it very simple. And this is what frustrates me. This is evidence that you are not a text-focused Christian. The fact that you have no idea about this being and the situation involved, that ancient situation of the divine council and the associations of the relationship between God and his creatures, and then the build-up of this peculiar form of evil that then there's biblical threads like Ezekiel 28 or Isaiah 14 and obviously Psalm 82, and you had this build-up of this Ha-Satan figure. Obviously the Ha-Satan figure in Job is not Satan, by the way. The Satan in Job is not the devil. The Satan in Job is a good angel opposed, because the word in Hebrew, Satan, just means to oppose. So for example, Yahweh, God himself, is called a Ha-Satan. In Numbers 22, the angel of the Lord, Ha-Satan's Balaam's donkey. God is a Satan against Israel in 1 Chronicles 21. It's just a word, like, get behind me, Satan, to Peter. You're opposing me. But then the accuser or the opposer is this particular agent of evil, which plays into deep Second Temple and even rabbinic theology, like for example the what's known as the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination that governs everything, which is again in turn the discussions involving chaos kampf and all that stuff. It's just the height of irony. The very topic you're discussing, one of the key components in highlighting the beauty and the truthfulness of the gospel and Jesus and God and all that stuff, with statements like pointless evil in that deductive argumentation. Satan, or that person or character or that being, is one of the key areas of research you should be conducting your research in, if you're going to be giving this topic. Just to summarize, there's no such thing as one fall. There's three falls. Genesis 3, Genesis 6, Genesis 11. Then the Bible story starts in Genesis 12 with Abraham. Those three falls, it's not just the devil figure, the Satan figure, that's caused the whole world to go into chaos. It's a combination of him in Genesis 3 with a whole myriad of them in Genesis 6, and then the rest of humanity in Genesis 11. It's this crescendo, this build-up. But by the time you reach Genesis 12, there's practically no one for God. But God doesn't want to lose the fight. He starts fresh with Abraham and builds up and builds up and builds up, reclaims the nations through the death of Jesus, which Satan promised to Jesus. He's like, I'll give you the nations if you bow down to me. Jesus doesn't bow down to him because Satan didn't know the plan. He didn't know that God's plan, the hidden secret, 1 Corinthians 2, God's hidden secret was to do exactly what he was going to do in Jesus, to defeat this very issue of pain, suffering, death, and chaos camp, which is something that Satan relishes in. And he thought that his opportunity to cause that on Christ would be his victory, not realizing that that's his undoing. That's why when Jesus cries out, Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? He's deliberately quoting that psalm because the psalm ends with vindication of the suffering, the righteous sufferer of that psalm. But if you go up in the first couple of verses of the psalm, it says that the bulls of Bashan is ancient Near Eastern language for the demonic stronghold of the demonic gods, the false gods. The bulls of Bashan are surrounding me, and they're gaping their mouths at me with like roaring, attacking lions. And the imagery here is Satan is fighting and killing and relishing in Jesus' death on the cross. Look at all the mockery that's taking place. The Jews are mocking Jesus, the Romans are mocking Jesus, and even the two thieves are mocking Jesus, except the second thief then turns and in Luke's account and asks for forgiveness. And then darkness comes over the land. There's just so much of that combat myth motif at play. And then, just because I had it up a moment ago, I just brought up 1 Peter 3. When you have this language of him, he could what? Bring issue of pain and suffering, the very topic that we're discussing. He then did what? He was put to death in a mortal body, but was brought to life by the Spirit. And then, what's the result? In which he went and made a proclamation to those imprisoned spirits, going all the way back to Genesis 6, when God waited patiently, blah, 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 right? And in the context of baptism, now, Peter is juxtaposing baptism as spiritual warfare. It's like if you're basically, to summarize, baptism is identifying in the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus. It's a very convenient way of when you're being baptized, you're going into the grave and then coming out. That's what baptism is. So when you baptize, what you're doing is, my allegiance now is with Jesus, who defeats pain, suffering, death, because that's my hope, right? Even though I will die, but I will rise. So How interesting. By removing dirt from your body, just like how when you get when you're buried in the ground, you know, it's like you're coming out onto heaven and is at the right hand of God, where, and then here's where it comes full circle. Those divine council beings that rebelled, like Satan included, all of them now, the angels, authorities, full circle. The death of Jesus was the most unexpected thing. Not even Satan knew that was the result. And it's because of the death of Jesus that now they've been made subject to Jesus. Satan thought by killing Jesus he'd be victorious. The unexpected thing is he trapped him. He literally shot himself in the foot by killing Jesus. So, do you see how the Satan, when you do a study on anything to do with Satan, it's a whole other hours and hours upon of material that you can touch on that is just another piece or another angle at everything we've been discussing so far.
How could God allow everyone who isn't a Christian to go to hell?
How could
Easy
God...
questions today.
Yeah, easy questions. Repeat the question one more time for me.
Sure.
How could God
allow everyone who isn't a Christian to go to hell?
There's so many different things. How do I whittle this down into like a minute? So first of all, the Christian view of condemnation is not like you're not condemned if you haven't heard the gospel. I actually played a clip on Friday where I asked Wayne Lane Craig a similar question. It's like, what do you do about the person who's never heard the gospel? Are they just like destined to go to hell? Like, how is that fair? And so his answer was basically that no, that's not the Christian view of condemnation. The Christian view of condemnation is that we condemn ourselves based on the light that we have. And so that is how we are actually condemned to hell, is that we condemn ourselves. And so that's how it's fair. It's not that it's not this situation where God is just punishing people that haven't heard. Rather, we condemn ourselves, as it says in Romans 1 and 2. And so I think there's much more to say on this topic, but I'm going to just leave it there. So I'll suggest people go look into that subject a little bit deeper.
Okay. What about atheists who are pessimistic about the world, that the world is terrible and...
I just want to clarify that I've been flirting more and more with a form of universalism, but I think all the models, eternal conscious torment, all that stuff, I think they are pieces of a larger, much grander scenario going on in death, in Christ. I've become more and more focused on the fact that hell is not some place that is, there's already like flames and spots, and like, in other words, it already has a geography of that's already like pre-made, and then God's like, okay, there you go, you reject me, so there you go. I'm starting to realize that no. If you reject God and the gospel, if you reject everything I've just discussed, in other words, God's defeat of chaos Kampf, if you reject that, God would be a tyrant if he went against your rejection. In other words, if he forced you to be saved, if he forced you to be with him, that is not love. That is, you're a slave. So he honors that. But then, by honoring that, if you think about it, who is actually the source of life and light and goodness and all those good things, right? It's him. Because he's God. So if you reject him, you are then going into hell, in the sense that hell is the absence of those good attributes of God. Because so God's like, okay, you don't want anything? Fine, I'll remove myself in whatever ontological parameters that are going on without his presence. I can't imagine anything worse than that. That is a form of hell, where his presence is no more. It's not that it's some prepared place. It's him removing himself. But I don't think it's forever, because this is where the other models come in. It's like there's still the opportunity. There's a New Jerusalem. There's still the opportunity to come if you want, and then find life. So I'm still wrestling with, like, I haven't made up my mind, is what I'm saying. But from what I can see so far, I think it's a combination of all the models. Because at the end of the day, Jesus is always the focus.
We shouldn't want to live here because it's so full of suffering like lifelong depression.
Yeah, so in that case, this version of the problem of evil would not work on that atheist. So you have to find an atheist that is also an optimist for this argument to work. So basically, no dice for that person.
All right. Looks like we have time for maybe one more question.
Okay.
What are your top 3 books and resources to further read on this topic?
Top 3. There is one. I'll just recommend one. Okay, and that's because of all the books that I've read, it's by far and away the best. And that is a book called The Problem, and now I've forgot the name of the book. It's about animal suffering. The title of the book, still escaping me. It's by Trent Doherty, is the guy who actually wrote the book. The Problem of Animal Suffering, something along those lines, where he basically gives a reason why God allows so much animal suffering in the world. But in turn, it also explains why humans suffer as well, because after all, we are a type of animal. But the book, The Problem of Animal Pain, something like that. I feel so bad for not knowing the title of it.
The Problem of Animal Pain.
There it is. I got it right. The Problem of Animal Pain by Trent Doherty. Highly recommended. Now, this one is a little bit on the technical side, so it does require a little bit more working through. But if you're really serious about the problem of evil and you want to know what is a really good response to this problem, you've got to do the hard work. You've got to go in and you've got to do the requisite research. And so I highly recommend that book to everybody who is really, really seriously interested in this question. Hey, it's me again. Actually, don't leave yet. I've got some.
Okay. My recommendations. Trent Doherty he's an interesting fellow. I like some of what he's written. But if you guys are interested in a good sort of both a scientific and a philosophical and a theological blend, all of it nicely blended into it just works as a someone who's really thought about these issues very well. I recommend you get the works of a theologian / philosopher of science. His name is, and I'll just share the Chrome tab. His name is Joshua M. Moretz. This guy is he's a Christian, fantastic insights. So, for example, he's written on, during the COVID pandemic, our virus is evil, our hominid special, human origins as the image and likeness of God. Let's see here. God's providence and randomness in nature, scientific and theological perspectives. One Imago Dei and the incarnation of the eschatological Adam. Let's see. There's one where he deals with this issue. Yeah, how absence makes things grow. Absential metaphysics and the teleodynamics of God as a love. Yeah, this is a very interesting paper he wrote. This one called "Does Jesus Save the Neanderthals? Theological Perspectives on the Evolutionary Origins and Boundaries of Human Nature." This is a fantastic review of a fantastic book, Darwin's Sacred Cause, Unity of Humanity. In other words, Darwin formed his theory of evolution because of his conviction that humans share a single origin. In other words, the black and the white man. There is no room for racism in a monogenesis model of human evolution. In fact, it was Darwin's family that had the logo of a black man, a black slave with chains, with the slogan, "Am I not a brother?" Darwin was anti-racist, and he wanted a scientific verification that racism is wrong and slavery is wrong. So the irony is evolution, as we understand it, is because of Darwin's his drive to prove that the black and the white are of the same race. It was the Christians in America, mostly Southern, that were fine with slavery and fine with racism, because those Christians thought that the black man were not from Adam, believe it or not. And Darwin was saying, no, doesn't Acts 17:26 say we're all from one blood? And the irony is, this is why I find it really ironic. Darwin's theory of evolution was a response to this racism. So, yeah. Okay. This paper I recommend you get: Animal Suffering, Evolution, and the Origins of Evil Toward a Free Creature's Defense. Yeah, I think I've given you like plenty to you know to chew on with all this. This is his dissertation, actually. This one here, chosen from among the animals, the end of human uniqueness and the election of the image of God. That's his PhD dissertation. Okay. All right, folks. This is close to 4 hours, so God bless you all, and Cameron, especially to you. I'm doing this in Christian love. My frustration is that if you could focus more so, actually exegeting the Greek, showing the scripture, actually going down to the very text, the holy text itself, that is the reason why you are even a Christian. Trust me, your apologetic not only will it become more personal to you, but it would just be that much more fruitful. And those atheists who criticize your ministry or your mission in this, as Peter says in 1 Peter 3, they'll be ashamed to slander you because of your good conduct in that context. Now, I'm not saying I'm doing it perfectly, or someone else is doing it perfectly, or whatever. I know I have flaws and improvements to make. But the point is, at least I have that as a focus, because let's just be honest, that should be our focus. And this is my encouragement to you as a fellow brother in Christ. Yeah. Oh, just got a super chat. Thanks so much, Sushi, for that super chat. Hi, Rob. You should invite Dr. Ryan Mullins to talk about Christian philosophy. He's one of few that does this, and it would be great opportunity to expose him to some great biblical. Okay. I'll take note of his name and I'll contact him. Thank you for that super chat. All right. God bless everyone. You take care. I'll see you again next time.